The fall of the Reich. Berlin in flames. Berlin, April 1945. The once proud capital of the Third Reich was unrecognizable. Streets that had echoed with Nazi parades just a decade earlier now lay in smoking ruin. Buildings stood like hollow skeletons, their windows shattered, their walls scorched black by fire. From the air, Berlin looked like a broken chessboard. Squares of rubble and fire crisscrossed with desperate survivors searching for food, water, or simply a place to hide. The Red Army was closing in. To the east and south, Soviet artillery boomed relentlessly, shells screaming overhead before slamming into the city. Each blast shook the ground and filled the air with choking dust. Civilians huddled in cellars and subway tunnels, praying they would not be buried alive. But above the chaos, the Nazi leadership clung to illusions. Hitler still dreamed of phantom armies that could push the Soviets back. In his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, he issued commands to divisions that no longer existed. Outside, Berliners could see the truth. The Reich was dying, and it was taking their city with it. A city under siege for weeks, the Soviet armies had been advancing relentlessly across eastern Germany. Stalin's commanders, Marshals Zhukov and Konyev, unleashed over 2.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery guns toward the capital. Berlin was their prize, and nothing would stop them. Inside the city, defenses were a desperate patchwork. The Wehrmacht was shattered, and what remained was thrown into the fight with little more than rifles and Panzerfausts. Boys as young as 12, members of the Hitler Youth, were handed weapons and told to hold street corners. Old men from the Volkssturm militia dug trenches and barricades, often armed with hunting rifles or nothing at all. For Berliners, every day brought new terror. Food supplies had collapsed. People traded jewelry for scraps of bread. Water was fetched from shattered pipes or bomb craters. The air stank of smoke, death, and despair. Yet, even in this chaos, life clung stubbornly to the ruins. Mothers tried to keep their children alive, telling stories in dark cellars to drown out the thunder of artillery. Musicians dragged battered violins into shelters to play melodies that reminded survivors of better days. But nothing could soften the horror of the siege. Fire from the east on April 16, 1945, the Soviets began their final assault with one of the most devastating artillery barges in history. For 30 minutes, thousands of guns unleashed hell on the German defenses outside Berlin. Survivors said the ground itself seemed to lift beneath them, the sound so loud it deafened men, even underground. By April 20th, ironically Hitler's birthday, the first shells began landing in central Berlin. Hitler emerged briefly from his bunker to greet a group of Hitler Youth, praising their bravery as the saviors of Germany. Many of those boys would die within days. By late April, the Soviets were closing in from all sides. Tank battles raged in the suburbs. The once grand avenues of Berlin became graveyards of steel, with Panthers and T-34s burning alongside shattered trams and buses. Civilians dashed from doorway to doorway, risking sniper fire just to find water. The heart of Berlin, Unter den Linden, the Reichstag, the Brandenburg Gate, was being swallowed by smoke and fire. Civilian desperation inside cellars. Families whispered in fear of what was coming. Word had spread of Soviet reprisals in the east. Villages looted, women assaulted, men dragged away. Now, the front was at their doorstep. Some Berliners hoped the Americans or British would reach the city first. But Berlin lay in the Soviet zone, agreed upon at Yalta months earlier. No help would come from the West. Instead, Berliners faced an army burning with vengeance. The Red Army had seen their villages destroyed, their families murdered by the German invasion of 1941. Now, they would take their revenge in the ruins of Berlin. And yet, some civilians still clung to fragments of normal life. Diaries from April 1945 describe people queuing for soup kitchens amid the rubble or walking miles through battle-scarred streets just to check on relatives. One woman recalled making her way past burning buildings to bring bread to her sick mother. Every step, I expected to be shot, but I had to go. This was Berlin in its final days. Hunger, fear, and determination twisted together in the shadow of collapse. The Nazi illusion while the city burned. Hitler's bunker became a theater of delusion. Maps spread across the walls showed armies that no longer existed. Hitler raged at his generals, blaming them for betrayals, insisting that relief forces were on the way. In reality, the once feared Wehrmacht had collapsed. Armies were in retreat, commanders surrendering, soldiers discarding uniforms to escape capture. But in Hitler's mind, Berlin was still the heart of a Reich that could rise again. He ordered young boys into suicidal counterattacks. He fantasized about divisions that would sweep in from the west. None of it was real. The city was doomed. A world ending in flames by the end of April, Berlin was a city of ghosts. Whole districts lay in ruin. The once grand Tiergarten Park had been churned into a wasteland of craters. Dead horses littered the streets, their carcasses hacked apart by starving civilians for food. Fires burned unchecked, casting an orange glow into the night sky. For many Berliners, this was the end not just of the war, but of their world. 12 years of Nazi propaganda had promised them victory on a 1,000-year Reich. Now, the Reich had lasted barely more than a decade, and it was ending in fire and ruin. And deep underground, in the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler would soon face his final hour. But what happened next would change everything. The world was about to witness Germany's surrender, and Berlin would pass into the hands of its conquerors. Hitler's last days in the bunker, the air inside the Führer bunker was heavy, damp, and suffocating. Just a few meters above, artillery shells shook the ground as the Red Army closed in. But down here, beneath the Reich Chancellery Gardens, Adolf Hitler spent his final days, a broken dictator clinging to delusions while his empire crumbled. The underground world of bunker itself was no palace. It was a claustrophobic warren of concrete chambers, reinforced by thick walls, but never intended to house the leader of a collapsing empire. Rooms were dimly lit by bare bulbs. The air was stale, carried through weak ventilation shafts. Water seeped in through cracks, leaving puddles across the floor. In these cramped corridors lived Hitler, Eva Braun, Joseph and Magda Goebbels with their 6 children, senior staff, secretaries, and guards. Together, they endured the thunder of Soviet artillery overhead, cut off from the world except for the crackle of telephones and the grim reports that came from the front. Every day, food supplies grew thinner. The once grand banquets of Nazi power had shrunk to meager rations. Canned vegetables, bread when it could be found, and endless cups of tea. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, adding to the suffocating atmosphere. Hitler's decline by April 1945. Hitler was no longer the fiery orator who had mesmerized crowds in the 1930s. Years of illness, stress, and the weight of defeat had reduced him to a frail figure. His left hand trembled uncontrollably from what doctors suspected was Parkinson's disease. He shuffled through the halls with a stooped posture, his once commanding voice often reduced to mumbling rants. Yet, despite his physical decline, his will remained fanatically rigid. He refused to leave Berlin, declaring he would share the fate of his capital. His generals pleaded with him to escape south to Bavaria, where German forces still held ground. But Hitler dismissed them all. "I will not leave this city. Ich will hier in Berlin." Delusions of victory in the map room. Hitler spent long hours hunched over battle charts, his shaking finger tracing phantom divisions that no longer existed. He raged against his commanders, accusing them of betrayal, cowardice, or incompetence. In reality, there was little left to command. Entire armies had been destroyed. The Reich had no fuel, no reserves, no hope. Still, Hitler clung to dreams of salvation. He spoke of Field Marshal Wenck's 12th Army, which he insisted would march north to relieve Berlin. But Wenck's forces were outnumbered and retreating west, hoping only to surrender to the Americans rather than be captured by the Soviets. Every failed counterattack deepened Hitler's rage. He shouted that the German people had failed him, that they no longer deserved survival. In those final days, his fury was turned not only on his enemies, but on his own nation. Eva Braun's loyalty amid the gloom. Eva Braun remained a strange contrast. Hitler's longtime companion, she had lived in the shadows for years, rarely appearing in public. But in April 1945, she joined him in the bunker, refusing every chance to escape. She filled the dark corridors with a strange brightness. Wearing her favorite dresses, she danced in the cramped rooms, played music on a gramophone, and tried to cheer the secretaries with laughter. Better to die with him here, she told them, than to live without him. Her presence gave the bunker an eerie mix of domesticity and doom. While shells thundered outside, she hosted small parties, pouring champagne and encouraging jokes. But everyone knew the truth. The end was coming. The Goebbels family, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, also remained in the bunker with his wife, Magda, and their 6 young children. Goebbels was fanatically loyal, declaring he would never live in a world without National Socialism. Magda adored Hitler as though he were part of her own family. She dressed her children neatly every day, combing their hair while the walls shook with artillery. She told them stories of the great future Germany would have, even as she planned their deaths to prevent them from living in a defeated world. The children played in the bunker hallways, their laughter haunting in the midst of despair. Many of the secretaries later said it was unbearable, knowing what awaited them. Collapse of the inner circle day by day, Hitler's circle grew smaller. Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, once his closest allies, had abandoned him. Göring sent a telegram asking to assume leadership, which Hitler saw as betrayal. Himmler secretly tried to negotiate peace with the Allies, sealing his fall from favor. In his rage, Hitler ordered their arrest, calling them traitors. Loyalty now meant staying in the bunker until death. The few who remained, Goebbels, Bormann, and a handful of officers, were bound to him by either fear or fanatic devotion. The decision by April 29th, Soviet troops were only streets away. The thunder of artillery was constant, shaking dust from the ceiling. Hitler gathered his closest aides and announced his decision. He would not be captured. He would take his own life. That same night, he married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony held in the bunker's map room. The couple toasted with champagne, their wedding reception overshadowed by the knowledge that they would be dead within hours. Later, Hitler dictated his political testament. In it, he raged against Jews, blamed his generals for betrayal, and insisted that National Socialism would live on. It was a final attempt to shape history, written as the walls of his empire literally collapsed around him. The final morning on April 30th, 1945, the bunker awoke to the sound of Soviet artillery pounding central Berlin. Hitler ate a simple breakfast with Eva, a light meal of tea and bread. He shook hands with his staff, thanked them for their loyalty, and retired to his private room with Eva at his side. Moments later, those outside heard a single gunshot. When they entered, Hitler was slumped lifeless on the sofa, a pistol in his hand. Eva lay beside him, having taken poison. The dictator who had unleashed the bloodiest war in history was gone. His empire had lasted 12 years. It ended in fire, ruin, and a concrete bunker beneath a city of ashes. But the fall of Hitler was not the end of Berlin's nightmare. Above ground, Soviet troops were breaking through the last defenses. The city itself would soon be in their hands. And what the Red Army found there would shock the world. The Red Army enters Berlin, a city on its knees. Berlin, April 30th, 1945. Above the bunker where Hitler's body lay cooling, the city trembled under the boots of a new conqueror. The Red Army had arrived. For the soldiers of the Soviet Union, this was not just another victory. It was revenge. 4 years earlier, Nazi Germany had invaded their homeland, burning villages, killing millions, leaving behind a trail of suffering. Now, in the ruins of Berlin, the Soviets came face to face with the broken heart of the Reich. The first sight of Berlin for many Soviet soldiers, Berlin was almost mythical. Soviet propaganda had painted it as the fortress of fascism, the lair of the beast that had tormented their homeland. When they finally entered its streets, they found not a fortress, but a graveyard. The city was a sea of rubble. Entire blocks were flattened. The famous Unter den Linden Boulevard was scarred with shell craters, and burned-out vehicles. Statues of Prussian kings and German emperors stood blackened and broken, their grandeur mocked by the ruins around them. Private diaries reveal the awe and horror of the Soviet troops. One soldier wrote, "This is not a city. It is a skeleton. Every step you take, the earth crunches with glass, ash, and the dead." Brutality and vengeance, but all quickly gave way to vengeance. The Red Army had lost over 20 million citizens in the war. Now, with Berlin in their grip, rage boiled over. Looting began almost immediately. Watches, jewelry, bicycles, radios, anything that could be carried away was seized. More terrifying were the reports of mass violence. Civilians hiding in cellars whispered of Soviet soldiers storming in, dragging men away and assaulting women. Some women smeared themselves with soot to appear older, hoping to escape notice. Others hid in attics, behind false walls, or even in sewers. To the Soviets, this was payback. They had seen their own sisters, mothers, and daughters brutalized by German troops years before. Now, they returned the horror in kind. It was a dark reminder that victory rarely came with mercy. The last offenders fall even as the Soviets advanced. Pockets of resistance clung desperately to survival. Hitler Youth with Panzerfaust stalked tanks through alleyways. SS units fought to the death around government buildings, refusing surrender. Snipers fired from broken rooftops, forcing Soviet soldiers to clear buildings one by one. At the Reichstag, the battle was fierce. Soviet commanders demanded that their troops capture the building at all costs. It was the ultimate symbol of German power. The fight raged room to room, with grenades and flamethrowers flushing out the defenders. Finally, on May 2nd, the Soviets raised the red flag above the shattered dome. Photographers captured the moment, a soldier hoisting the hammer and sickle banner high over the ruins. It was staged, repeated for the cameras, but its symbolism was undeniable. The Reich was dead. The Soviet Union had triumphed. Civilians in shock for the people of Berlin, the arrival of the Red Army was both liberation and nightmare. On the one hand, the war was finally ending. No more bombs, no more hopeless orders to fight to the last bullet. But peace came wrapped in fear. Civilians crept out of cellars, blinking in the daylight after weeks underground. What they found was a city unrecognizable. Streets were blocked with rubble. Corpses lay unburied in courtyards. Water trickled from shattered pipes, collected in buckets by desperate families. Hunger gnawed at everyone. Food was almost gone. Civilians bartered family heirlooms for scraps of bread from soldiers. Children wandered aimlessly, searching for parents who would never return. Some Berliners tried to speak with the Soviets, offering gifts or pleading for kindness. Others simply stayed silent, hoping not to be noticed. For many, survival meant invisibility. The Soviet flag over Berlin on May 2nd, Berlin officially surrendered. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the city's defenses, ordered his remaining troops to lay down their arms. The war in Europe was not yet formally over, but for Berliners, the nightmare had shifted into a new reality: occupation. That same day, Soviet war correspondents wrote triumphantly of their victory. The Red Army had avenged Stalingrad, avenged Leningrad, avenged the millions killed. Stalin himself declared that history would remember Berlin as the place where fascism was crushed. But behind the propaganda lay a city broken in spirit. One woman described seeing the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. It was as if the world we knew had ended. We were not Germans anymore, not even people. We were spoils of war. Berlin on its knees by early May. The streets of Berlin were filled with Soviet troops. Soldiers camped in ruined houses, set up kitchens in courtyards, and dragged artillery through avenues that had once held Nazi parades. Tanks rumbled past burned-out streetcars. Columns of prisoners, German soldiers in torn uniforms, marched east under guard, bound for camps where many would never return. The city had no government, no law, no order. Berlin belonged to the Red Army. And for the civilians who had survived, this was only the beginning. They would now live under the rule of their conquerors, in a city divided, broken, and haunted. But what would come next shocked even the survivors. For the first time in its history, Berlin would not belong to Germany alone. Soon, Americans, British, and French forces would march into the ruins. The city would become a pawn in a new global struggle, the Cold War. Unconditional surrender. The moment Germany fell, May 1945. The guns that had thundered for 6 long years finally fell silent. Across Europe, soldiers lowered their weapons, civilians stepped out of cellars, and flags of surrender fluttered above ruined cities. The Reich that had promised a 1,000-year empire was gone in barely more than a decade. Its end came not with honor or dignity, but with a single word: surrender. The last commanders when Hitler took his life on April 30th, 1945, he left behind chaos. The Nazi regime had no clear leader. In his will, he named Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as a successor, a man stationed miles away in northern Germany. But in Berlin, the reality was different. The city was collapsing, its leaders either dead, captured, or preparing their own suicides. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, became Reich Chancellor for barely 1 day. He poisoned his 6 children, killed his wife, and then took his own life. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, tried to flee the city but vanished in the ruins. What remained of Nazi leadership was scattered, broken, and powerless. It fell to General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defenses, to face the truth. On May 2nd, he ordered the last German troops in the city to lay down their arms. For Berlin, the war was over. The journey to Reims, but surrender could not just be local, it had to be total. The Allies demanded an unconditional end to the war. Donitz, hoping to save as many Germans as possible from Soviet captivity, tried to negotiate partial surrenders to the Americans and British. But Eisenhower refused. Only full, unconditional surrender would end the bloodshed. On May 7th, 1945, German representatives were escorted to the city of Reims in France, where the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was based. In a modest schoolhouse turned command post, they were brought before Eisenhower's staff. The terms were clear. Germany must surrender unconditionally to all Allied forces, both East and West. General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, signed the document at 2:41 a.m. His signature sealed the fate of what remained of the Reich. V-Day, a world rejoices the next day, May 8th, 1945, was declared victory in Europe Day. Across the world, bells rang, flags waved, and crowds filled the streets. In London, thousands gathered outside Buckingham Palace, cheering as King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill appeared on the balcony. Churchill declared, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget, Japan remains unsubdued." In Paris, people danced in the streets, hugging strangers, singing the Marseillaise. In New York, Times Square erupted into celebration, confetti raining from skyscrapers as sailors kissed nurses in a moment captured forever in photographs. For millions, it was the greatest relief they had ever known. The war that had consumed their youth, destroyed their homes, and stolen their loved ones was finally over in Europe. A different silence in Berlin, but in Berlin, there were no joyful crowds, no music, no dancing. The city was a corpse, and its people were survivors of a nightmare. The surrender meant only that the fighting had stopped. Hunger still gnawed, bombs still smoldered, and the fear of occupation hung heavy in the air. For German soldiers, surrender often meant captivity, long marches eastward towards Soviet camps, or being herded into makeshift cages by American and British troops. Many knew they might never see home again. For civilians, surrender was both relief and despair. Relief that the bombs would stop. Despair that their nation was defeated, its leaders dead, its future uncertain. One Berlin woman wrote in her diary, "We are told the war is over, but I cannot feel it. The hunger is still here. The fear is still here. Only the flags have changed." The Soviet ceremony in Berlin the Western Allies had their surrender at Reims, but Stalin demanded more. He wanted Germany's defeat recognized in Berlin itself, the very heart of the enemy. And so, on May 8th, May 9th in Moscow, due to the time difference, another surrender was signed. In a former German officer's mess in the suburb of Karlshorst, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, representing the Wehrmacht, signed the unconditional surrender before Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and British, American, and French commanders. The ceremony was more solemn, more symbolic. This was the final nail in the coffin. For the Soviets, May 9th would forever be remembered as Victory Day, a holiday still celebrated with parades, fireworks, and remembrance across Russia and Eastern Europe. The world after the surrender of Germany, ended one war, but it also planted the seeds of another. The Allies who had fought side by side were now looking at each other with suspicion. The Soviets controlled Eastern Europe. The Americans and British held the West. And in the middle lay Berlin, broken, occupied, and destined to become the front line of the Cold War. For now, though, the world breathed in silence. Guns were lowered. Soldiers went home or to prison camps. Families embraced loved ones who returned and mourned those who never would. The nightmare of Nazi domination was over. But for Berlin and for Germany, the nightmare of occupation was only beginning. But what would life look like in a city carved into pieces by its conquerors? The answer lay in the arrival of the Allied powers who would soon take their places among the ruins. A divided victory. Allies' step into the Rubble Berlin in May 1945 was no longer a capital. It was a carcass. The city that had once dazzled Europe with its grand boulevards, opera houses, and monuments was now a hollow ruin. Its people shuffled through rubble-strewn streets like ghosts, their faces thin with hunger, their eyes hollow from nights without sleep. Above this graveyard of empire, for victors prepared to divide the spoils. The Allies, Soviet, American, British, and French, had all bled to defeat Hitler. Now, they were about to share control of his fallen city. But beneath the surface of victory lurked tension. Berlin was to be not just occupied, but divided. And that division would shape the fate of the world. Berlin, a prize and a problem of the Yalta Conference in February 1945, months before the city fell, the Allied leaders had already decided Berlin would be split into 4 occupation zones. The Soviets would take the eastern half. The Americans, British, and French would divide the western half among them. This meant Berlin, though lying deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, would itself be carved into 4 slices, an island of shared power surrounded by Soviet control. At the time, it seemed a practical solution. In reality, it was a recipe for rivalry. But before the Allies could occupy their zones, the city had to be stabilized. And for the moment, it belonged entirely to the Red Army. Soviet triumph, the Soviets were the first to enter Berlin, and they acted as conquerors. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, had the honor of presenting the city to Stalin. Soviet flags fluttered from every surviving rooftop. Red stars were painted on walls and street signs. Soldiers paraded through the shattered Brandenburg Gate, their boots crunching on broken glass. For the Soviet Union, this was more than victory, it was justice. They had lost millions of lives, seen their cities razed, their families slaughtered. Now, they stood in the capital of the enemy. To them, Berlin was a trophy of blood. But with victory came vengeance. Looting spread unchecked. Trains packed with plundered furniture, art, and machinery began heading east. Soviet officers claimed grand houses for themselves, while civilians hid whatever little they had left. The Western Allies arrived by early July 1945. The Americans, British, and French arrived to take possession of their sectors. The city they encountered stunned them. General Omar Bradley, upon entering, wrote, "Berlin is not a city. It is a monument to destruction." American troops set up headquarters in Zellendorf, a leafy suburb in the southwest. The British moved into their zone in Charlottenburg and Spandau. The French, despite having been defeated by Germany in 1940, were given their own small sector in the north as a gesture of restored honor. The handover was tense. Soviet soldiers eyed the Western troops with suspicion. Smiles were rare. Cooperation was thin. Berlin was united in destruction, but already divided in power. Civilians watch in silence for Berliners. The sight of foreign flags flying over their neighborhoods was surreal. They had been taught for years to see the Allies as enemies, monsters, destroyers. Now, these same enemies patrolled their streets as rulers. Many were too exhausted to resist. They simply watched as jeeps rolled past, as Allied soldiers set up checkpoints, as new orders were posted on walls. For them, survival mattered more than politics. Yet whispers spread. Who would treat them better, the Soviets or the Westerners? Which flag offered hope, and which promised fear? The Potsdam shadow as the Allies settled into Berlin. Their leaders gathered just outside the city for the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. In a stately villa by a quiet lake, Truman, Churchill, later replaced by Attlee, and Stalin discussed the future of Germany and the world. On paper, they agreed Germany would be demilitarized, denazified, and divided into zones of occupation. Berlin would remain under joint Allied control. But beneath the speeches and handshakes, distrust simmered. The Soviets intended to keep Eastern Europe under their grip. The Americans and British sought to prevent communist expansion. And Berlin, caught in the middle, became the fault line of this uneasy peace. A divided victory the Allies had won together, but they could not rule together. The unity forged in war was already unraveling in peace. Soviet soldiers scrawled graffiti on the Reichstag. We came and conquered. American GIs handed out chocolate to German children. British officers held parades with stiff formality. The French hoisted their tricolor with pride. To the world, it seemed like a victory without unity. Berlin was no longer the capital of Germany. It was a stage where four rival powers acted out their ambitions. The war was over, but the seeds of the next great conflict had already been sown. But for ordinary Berliners, politics mattered little compared to daily survival. Their city was rubble, their stomachs empty, their futures uncertain. What was it like to live in such ruins? That is the story of the next chapter. First impressions. Soldiers seeing Berlin's ruins when the Allied soldiers first stepped into Berlin. Many of them felt as if they had landed on another planet. The city that had once been the proud heart of the Nazi Empire was now little more than ash and stone. Nothing prepared them for the silence, the smell, or the sight of millions of people living among ruins. A city of ghost Berlin had been bombed relentlessly by the Allies since 1943. By the time Soviet artillery and tanks rolled in, over 70% of the city's buildings were destroyed or heavily damaged. Grand hotels had collapsed into dust. Theaters stood roofless, their seats buried under rubble. Once elegant boulevards like Unter den Linden were cratered, choked with burned-out vehicles. American and British officers who arrived in July 1945 wrote about the eerie stillness. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Howley of the U.S. Army later described it as a city where even the air seemed exhausted. Soldiers marched through streets lined with hollow shells of buildings, the smell of smoke and rotting corpses still lingering in the air. Berlin was not a city at all. It was a graveyard. The smell of defeat, the first thing most soldiers noticed wasn't the sight, but the smell. Rotting flesh, horse carcasses, and uncollected garbage filled the air with a sour stench. Fires still smoldered in corners of the city weeks after the surrender. Wells and rivers had been contaminated, leaving water foul with ash and chemicals. Soldiers had to cover their faces with scarves or handkerchiefs as they moved through certain districts. For civilians who had endured it for weeks, the stench had become normal, an invisible reminder of how low Berlin had fallen. First encounters with civilians for many Allied soldiers. The next shock came not from the ruins, but from the people. They expected hostility, maybe even resistance. Instead, they found exhaustion. Civilians stared with hollow eyes, silent and cautious. Some raised their hands instinctively, fearing arrest. Others rushed forward, desperate to barter for food. American soldiers often became instant heroes to children by handing out chewing gum, chocolate, or canned goods. British troops were approached by women offering jewelry in exchange for bread. Soviet soldiers, still intoxicated by victory, were harsher. Some Berliners saw them as liberators, others as predators. To the soldiers, it was clear these were not the proud Nazis of propaganda. These were broken people trying to survive. The shock of total war for Allied soldiers who had seen battlefields across Europe, from Normandy to the Ardennes, Berlin was on another level. Entire neighborhoods were nothing but rubble. In some districts, not a single building stood intact. One American GI wrote home, "Berlin is worse than anything I saw in France. It is as if a giant hand has crushed the city flat." Even hardened Soviet troops, who had marched through Stalingrad and Warsaw, admitted Berlin stunned them. It was not just destroyed, it was obliterated. The capital of the Reich had been turned into a punishment, a symbol of total defeat. Soldiers among the ruins, yet soldiers are still men. And amid the horror, curiosity surfaced. Some wandered through famous landmarks, exploring the Reichstag's burned-out chambers or taking photographs beside the shattered Brandenburg Gate. Others scavenged for souvenirs, swastika flags, Nazi medals, or porcelain from abandoned houses. For Western soldiers, Berlin also felt surreal. Here was the city they had heard about for years, the symbol of Hitler's power. Now was at their feet broken. Victory tasted of ashes. Fear of what came next, but admiration and curiosity were mixed with unease. Soldiers sensed the fragile balance between occupiers and civilians. A wrong move, a drunken fight, or an act of revenge could spark violence. Rumors spread of werewolf units, Nazi loyalists supposedly preparing guerrilla attacks. Most of these fears were exaggerated, but the tension was real. The Allies were not entering a peaceful city. They were stepping into a powder keg of hunger, anger, and despair. The verdict of first impressions for the soldiers of all four powers, their first impression of Berlin was the same. This was not just a conquered city. It was the ruins of a world war, the physical embodiment of destruction. A Soviet soldier scrawled graffiti on a Reichstag wall, "Berlin is ours." An American GI scribbled in his journal, "If this is victory, it looks like hell." Both were right. But if soldiers were shocked, the civilians were devastated. They had lived through the inferno, and now they faced the occupation. What was life like for them in this ruined capital? Civilians in shock. Survival in a dead city. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Berliners emerged from basements, subway tunnels, and bomb shelters like moles blinded by daylight. They stepped into a city that no longer resembled their home. The Reich had promised a 1,000-year empire. What they saw was rubble stretching to the horizon. For civilians, defeat was not just political. It was personal. Every family had lost something: a father at the front, a mother in the bombings, a child to hunger. Survival became the only goal. Hunger without end food was the most urgent crisis. By the war's end, Berlin's food distribution system had collapsed. Warehouses were empty, farmland had been bombed, and rail lines destroyed. Daily rations for an adult Berlin civilian in summer 1945 fell to as little as 1,000 calories a day, barely half what was needed to survive. Bread was made from sawdust and potato peels. Soup was often nothing more than boiled weeds. Children scavenged in ruins, digging through trash for edible scraps. Women lined up for hours at soup kitchens run by the occupying powers, clutching tin cans, hoping the pot would not run out before their turn. For many, hunger was constant. Malnutrition left children with swollen bellies and brittle bones. Water, shelter, and diseased water pipes had burst across the city, leaving whole districts dry. People fetched water from polluted rivers or broken hydrants. Typhus and dysentery spread quickly. Housing was equally dire. With nearly 500,000 apartments destroyed, families squeezed into single surviving rooms, often with strangers. Some lived in ruins with nothing but tarps for roofs. Entire staircases ended in midair. Windows gaped open to the weather, and every storm sent fear into those beneath crumbling walls. Doctors, themselves starving, struggled to treat patients without medicine. Pharmacies were looted, hospitals overcrowded. Ordinary coughs turned deadly. The emotional collapse for civilians, shock was not just physical, it was emotional. The Nazi state had collapsed overnight. Propaganda that promised final victory had been replaced by silence. The Führer was dead, the government gone. Many Berliners simply sat in the streets, dazed, staring at the ruins. Women, who now made up the majority of the population, shouldered the burden of survival. They were known as the Trümmerfrauen, Rubble women. Day after day, they cleared bricks from collapsed buildings, stacking them into neat piles for reuse. With men dead or prisoners of war, these women rebuilt Berlin with their bare hands. But their strength was tested beyond labor. Many had endured sexual violence during the Soviet advance. They carried trauma in silence, focusing on feeding their children, patching roofs, and burying the dead. The shadow of guilt, another weight, hung heavy. Guilt. Though many Berliners claimed ignorance of Nazi crimes, whispers of concentration camps and atrocities spread as Allied soldiers brought evidence. Photos of corpses from Buchenwald and Dachau appeared in newspapers. Some Berliners dismissed them as lies. Others looked away in shame. But deep down, the knowledge grew that their suffering was not random. It was punishment. Bartering for life with the Reichsmark nearly worthless, a black market emerged overnight. Cigarettes became the new currency. A carton of American cigarettes could buy bread, meat, even a bicycle. Women traded jewelry, family heirlooms, or anything of value for food. Children carried stolen coal in buckets to sell on street corners. Men returned from prisoner of war camps and immediately joined the barter economy, bringing stories of Siberia or American hospitality. Every day was negotiation. Survival meant constant trade, constant risk. Children of the rubble for children, the war never truly ended. They played among bombed-out houses, pretending ruined tanks were castles. Some were orphans, forming gangs to steal food. Others were raised by weary mothers or elderly grandparents. Teachers held classes in basements or courtyards, using broken bricks as desks. Chalk was scarce, books rarer still. Lessons were short, interrupted by hunger pangs or the sound of nearby construction. Yet children also brought resilience. Their laughter in ruined streets became one of the few signs of life. A city in shock in those first weeks of occupation, Berlin was less a capital than a giant refugee camp. The people moved through ruins like shadows, silent, hungry, stunned. They no longer asked when the nightmare would end. Instead, they asked how to live through tomorrow. But as they struggled, the Allies were already reshaping their lives, deciding what they could eat, where they could live, and even what they could believe. The hunger winter, starvation, and black markets the summer of 1945 had been brutal for Berlin. Food was scarce, housing was wrecked, and daily survival depended on improvisation. But as autumn turned to winter, things grew worse. The city faced one of the coldest and hungriest winters in living memory. For Berliners, the war was over, but the struggle to survive had only begun. A winter without warmth, the first problem was heat. Coal, once abundant, was nearly impossible to find. Bombed railways meant no steady supply, and Soviet authorities prioritized shipments back east. Families huddled in freezing apartments, stuffing broken windows with rags, paper, or wood planks. To keep warm, Berliners stripped entire buildings for fuel. Doors, window frames, even floorboards were pried loose and fed into stoves. Some dismantled abandoned Nazi offices just to light a single fire. The irony was clear. The Third Reich had once dreamed of lasting 1,000 years. Its headquarters were now burned, brick by brick, just to boil potatoes. Starvation on a grand scale if heat was scarce. Food was scarcer still. By late 1945, the official daily ration for Berliners had fallen below 1,000 calories. That was less than what concentration camp prisoners had once been given. Bread was mixed with ground-up straw or sawdust to stretch supplies. Meat was virtually non-existent. Potatoes, the staple of the German diet, were rotting in storage due to poor transport. Hunger shaped every aspect of life. Children fainted in schools. Adults collapsed in tram lines. Hospital beds filled not with war wounds, but with malnutrition cases. A Berlin doctor later said, "We did not treat patients that winter. We kept them alive, one day at a time." The black market rules in the shadows of this crisis. The black market thrived. It sprawled across ruined squares, alleys, and railway stations. Cigarettes became the most valuable currency, more stable than Reichsmarks, more practical than gold. An American GI's cigarette could buy a loaf of bread. A carton might fetch a whole chicken or a pair of shoes. Women traded heirlooms, silver cutlery, or wedding rings for a handful of butter. Men scavenged army depots or bribed guards to get coffee, sugar, or chocolate. This new economy was risky. Allied authorities tried to crack down, sending patrols to confiscate illegal goods. But the black market was too deeply woven into daily survival. Without it, many Berliners would not have made it through the winter. The price of survival, the desperation of the hunger winter, blurred moral boundaries. Respectable citizens begged on street corners. Middle-class women, once school teachers or office clerks, sold themselves for food or cigarettes. Children became smugglers, slipping through fences and ruins to steal coal from trains or food from military depots. One boy later recalled, "We were hungry every day. We stole because we had no choice. If you caught us, you took our bread. If you let us go, we lived another day." Such choices were common. Survival meant compromise, sacrifice, and shame. Allied rations in relief, the occupiers were not blind to the suffering. The Soviets distributed some food in their zone, but much of it was taken as reparations. American and British forces, once settled in July 1945, began shipping in supplies. Army kitchens provided thin soups to civilians, and some units shared rations with children crowding their jeeps. But distribution was uneven, and Allied priorities were focused on military needs first. For Berliners, relief often came in the form of unofficial kindness. A GI slipping chocolate to a child, a British soldier handing out tea, or a Soviet officer giving bread to a starving family. These small gestures became legends in neighborhoods. In a world of hunger, a single piece of chocolate could symbolize hope. Winter of silence as snow fell over Berlin, the ruins grew quiet. Streets that once echoed with marching boots now lay muffled under ice. Smoke from scavenged fires curled into the sky, thin and weak. Civilians wrapped themselves in rags, bartered in whispers, and prayed the spring would come quickly. Many did not live to see it. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of Berliners died during the hunger winter of 1945 to 46, most from starvation, disease, or exposure. But those who survived remembered it as a turning point, the moment when Berlin truly hit rock bottom. From that pit of suffering, the long road to recovery would begin. Yet before recovery, there was still judgment. The victors were not content to simply feed Berlin. They intended to change it, politically, culturally, morally. Allied control, military governors and rules. When Berlin fell, it did not simply belong to the victors, it was managed by them. In July 1945, the city became the stage for one of the most unusual experiments in history, for rival nations ruling a single defeated capital together. Berliners, already crushed by hunger and ruin, now faced a new reality: life under foreign command. The quadripartite agreement at Yalta and Potsdam, the Allies had agreed that Berlin would be divided into 4 zones of occupation. The Soviets, who had taken the city, kept the eastern half. The Americans, British, and French split the western side into 3 sectors. The city as a whole was governed by the Allied Kommandantura, a joint body of military governors representing all 4 powers. Each week, the generals met in Berlin to debate laws, decrees, and policies. On paper, it was a model of cooperation. In practice, it was a constant tug of war. Every decision, from ration sizes to street signs, became a political battlefield. Military governors take charge. Each zone had its own military governor. Soviet zone. Marshal Zhukov's men ruled with a heavy hand. Their orders emphasized reparations, arrests of Nazis, and the installation of loyal communist officials. American zone. General Lucius D. Clay soon emerged as a key figure. Practical, stern, and politically aware, Clay believed in rebuilding Germany as a democracy. British zone. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery initially oversaw matters, later replaced by Governor Sholto Douglas. The British struggled with shortages but prioritized order. French zone. Smaller, yet fiercely independent. The French, scarred by their 1940 defeat, insisted on their share of Berlin. Their zone in the north included Reunification and Wedding. Each governor had near absolute authority in his sector. Berliners quickly learned that their lives could be very different depending on which side of the city they lived in. New rules in a dead city, the first orders came swiftly. All Nazi organizations were dissolved. The swastika was banned. Streets named after Hitler and Goebbels were renamed. Radios, newspapers, and public meetings were placed under strict Allied control. Curfews were imposed. Civilians had to register with occupation offices. Identity papers were checked at every corner. Even bicycles required permits. The Allies wanted control, but they also wanted to reshape Berlin. They insisted on denazification, the removal of Nazis from government, schools, and businesses. Teachers were interrogated. Judges were replaced. Thousands of former Nazi party members were banned from public service. For Berliners, it meant uncertainty. A man could be a tram driver one week and unemployed the next, depending on what was found in his past. Denazification and justice, the Allies were determined to uproot the ideology that had fueled war. Posters went up showing photos of concentration camp victims with captions like, "These crimes, your guilt." Berliners were ordered to attend screenings of Allied films documenting Nazi atrocities. Many watched in silence. Some wept, others muttered denial. It was a forced confrontation with a truth long ignored. In schools, new textbooks were introduced. Lessons shifted from glorifying Hitler to condemning dictatorship. Children who had once worn Hitler Youth uniforms now read about democracy and international cooperation. But denazification was uneven. Some Berliners quietly lied about their past, hiding Nazi ties. Others were too essential to remove. A doctor, a tram conductor, or an engineer might keep his job if no replacement could be found. Propaganda and influence, each occupying power also sought to win hearts and minds. The Soviets pushed communist ideology, opening newspapers like Taglish Rundschau and organizing workers' committees. They presented themselves as liberators of the working class. The Americans promoted democracy and freedom of speech, encouraging newspapers, radio programs, and cultural exchanges. The British emphasized stability, law, and order, focusing on rebuilding institutions. The French leaned heavily on tradition and culture, reopening schools and theaters in their zone. For Berliners, it was confusing. One street carried Soviet posters of Lenin. Another blared American jazz from radios. The city became a living propaganda battleground. Life under occupation, Berliners adapted. They queued for food at Soviet distribution centers, then listened to American broadcasts in the evening. They cleared rubble under British orders, then attended a French art exhibition the next day. Some resented the occupiers. Others were grateful for their survival. Most simply endured, shifting with the wind of whichever flag flew above their sector. One Berliner later summed it up: "We had four governments. None spoke the same language. All told us how to live, but we listened only to our stomachs." The first cracks, though the Allies presented a united front, cracks quickly appeared. Soviet and Western authorities clashed over everything: prisoner releases, food supplies, even street repairs. Each side accused the other of breaking agreements. For Berliners, the divisions were subtle at first: a stricter curfew in the east, a freer press in the west. But these differences would soon deepen into something far greater: Berlin was occupied, controlled, and reshaped. Yet beneath the surface, it was also becoming divided. What began as an uneasy partnership was slowly turning into a confrontation. First, tensions. Allies versus Soviets in Berlin in the summer of 1945. Berlin was a city split four ways, but held together by fragile agreements. On the surface, Allied leaders spoke of cooperation, of working together to rebuild Germany. But beneath the ceremonies and speeches, suspicion was already spreading. For Berliners, it soon became clear the victors of the war were beginning to turn into rivals. The uneasy handshake when American, British, French, and Soviet troops first stood side by side in Berlin, it was a moment staged for cameras. Soldiers exchanged stiff handshakes, flags were raised, and photographs were taken to symbolize unity. But away from the crowds, officers traded hard stares instead of smiles. The Soviets, who had paid the bloodiest price to take the city, resented the Western Allies arriving months later to claim their share. The Western powers, in turn, distrusted the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe and their harsh treatment of Berliners. The occupation had begun with cooperation, but mistrust was already eroding it. Food and fuel disputes, the first flashpoints were practical: food and fuel. The Soviets controlled the countryside surrounding Berlin. They had the farms, the grain, the livestock, but they diverted much of it back to the Soviet Union as reparations, leaving Berlin short. Western sectors depended on Soviet shipments to feed their people, and often the trains never came. American officials accused the Soviets of deliberately starving the Western zones. The Soviets countered that the Western Allies were hoarding supplies for themselves. Hunger, once just a civilian crisis, became a political weapon. The same applied to coal. With winter looming, shortages threatened survival. Soviet officials controlled much of the supply and decided who received shipments. The Western Allies saw this as blackmail. Arrests and espionage. Another tension was justice. Soviet authorities began mass arrests in their zone, targeting anyone they labeled as Nazis, collaborators, or potential opponents. Many Berliners simply vanished into the night, dragged from their homes, never to be seen again. Rumors spread of deportations to Siberia. Western officials demanded transparency, but the Soviets refused. At the same time, Soviet intelligence flooded Berlin, recruiting spies, planting informants, and monitoring Western activities. American and British counterintelligence responded in kind. By late 1945, Berlin was already the espionage capital of Europe, a city where neighbors no longer trusted neighbors. The Kommandantura in deadlocked the Allied Kommandantura, the joint governing body, was supposed to guide Berlin together. Instead, it became a stage for confrontation. Every issue sparked arguments. The Soviets vetoed Western proposals. The Americans blocked Soviet plans. Meetings stretched for hours, often ending with shouting and walkouts. One British officer described it as 4 men in a boat, each rowing in a different direction. For Berliners, the result was confusion. Laws changed depending on which sector they lived in. Crossing into another part of the city meant entering another world, with new rules, new propaganda, and new dangers. Propaganda wars began by late 1945. The city's walls were plastered with competing posters. In the east, Soviet billboards showed workers raising hammers, calling for solidarity with Moscow. In the west, American and British posters praised freedom, democracy, and rebuilding. The French emphasized culture and tradition, reopening theaters and schools with French influence. Radio waves carried the battle further. Soviet broadcasts denounced Western imperialism. American stations played jazz and swing, symbols of modern freedom. Berliners tuned in secretly, choosing stations based on curiosity, defiance, or simple hunger for distraction. Civilians caught in the middle for ordinary Berliners. These political battles meant more waiting in food lines, more uncertainty about tomorrow. Some whispered that the Soviets would never leave. Others dreamed the Americans would bring real abundance. But most did not care about ideologies. They cared about bread, coal, and shelter. They had survived the Nazis. Now, they were trying to survive their liberators. The first cracks in unity by the end of 1945, one truth was clear. The Allied partnership was already breaking apart. The war had ended, but peace had not arrived. Instead, Berlin was becoming a front line, not of bombs and bullets, but of politics and propaganda. The seeds of the Cold War had been planted, and in Berlin, they were already beginning to sprout. But the story of division was not just political, it was also human. How did Berliners themselves adapt to 4 different rulers for different laws and 4 competing visions for their future? Daily life under 4 flags. How Berliners adapted to live in Berlin in late 1945 was to live in 4 cities at once. The Allied flags fluttered above ruins, Soviet red in the east, American stars and stripes in the south, British Union Jack in the west, and the French tricolor in the north. But beneath those flags were not just governments, but entire worlds. Berliners quickly learned that survival meant adaptation. You had to know which rules applied on which street, how to speak to which soldier, and which flag might feed you today. Crossing invisible borders, Berlin was divided into 4 sectors, but the borders weren't fenced yet. People could move freely across them, though each crossing brought risks. In the Soviet sector, you might face questioning, searches, or sudden arrest. In the American zone, you could find chocolate and jazz, but also stricter curfews. The British emphasized discipline and order. The French sector, smaller and often overlooked, was a mix of suspicion and cultural pride. Berliners joked that you could live in one sector, work in another, and barter in a third, as long as you were careful whose uniform you were smiling at. A new kind of passport. The ration card, the real power in post-war Berlin, wasn't a general or a politician. It was the ration card. Every Berliner carried one, issued by the occupation authorities. Without it, you couldn't get food, coal, or clothing. Losing a card meant hunger. Forging one was risky, but common. Rations vary by sector. The Soviets distributed black bread, potatoes, and soup, often in smaller portions. The Americans provided more variety when supplies allowed. The British focused on fairness, keeping strict records. The French added cultural flair, opening small cafes where ration coupons could sometimes be exchanged for wine. Civilians learned to compare, trade, and move between sectors in search of better rations. Life became a map of survival strategies. Work and rubble unemployment was high, but there was no shortage of work, only of pay. The most visible jobs were clearing rubble. The Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, became symbols of survival. With bare hands, shovels, and wheelbarrows, they cleared entire neighborhoods brick by brick. Children helped, stacking usable bricks for reuse. The Allies encouraged this as both reconstruction and discipline. Rebuilding your city was also atonement for your past. Men returning from prisoner of war camps often joined these crews or found work in repairing trams, rebuilding bridges, or restoring utilities. But wages were nearly worthless. Real pay came from food, cigarettes, or favors. A city of barter, Berlin's economy was less about money than barter. A coat could be traded for a sack of potatoes. A family heirloom might buy coal. Cigarettes remained the unofficial currency. Some Berliners became skilled traders, cycling across sectors with small carts, exchanging American chocolate for Soviet flour or British tea for French wine. Others joined the black market openly, hawking goods at Potsdamer Platz or Alexanderplatz. The Allies tried to crack down, but the barter economy was stronger than law. Without it, survival was impossible. Entertainment and escapism, even in ruins, Berliners sought distraction. American soldiers opened cinemas in their zone, showing Hollywood films. British troops staged concerts and plays. The French reopened opera houses, determined to revive culture. The Soviets organized rallies, parades, and workers' festivals. Berliners attended all of them. They weren't picky. Whether it was swing dancing in the American sector or marching songs in the Soviet one, it was a brief escape from hunger and rubble. Children between flags, children adapted fastest. They played in ruins, turning bomb craters into playgrounds. They learned to recognize uniforms. Soviets meant fear, Americans meant candy, British meant stern order, French meant curiosity. Many became multilingual without realizing it, picking up words of Russian, English, and French from soldiers and neighbors. They were the first generation of Berliners raised in four worlds at once. The psychology of adaptation above all, Berliners learned not to take sides, at least not openly. You nodded to the Soviet officer on Monday, smiled at the American GI on Tuesday, and bartered with a British sergeant on Wednesday. Survival meant flexibility. Ideology mattered less than bread. Politics mattered less than coal. As one Berliner put it, we had no loyalty but to our stomachs. Whoever fed us was our friend that day. Berliners had adapted to four rulers, but the cracks between those rulers were widening. Each sector felt more different by the month, and soon those invisible borders would harden into real divisions. The Soviet-style East Berlin's harsh occupation when Berlin fell in May 1945, the Soviet Union held the city in its grip. The Red Army had stormed the Reichstag, raised its flag over the ruins, and declared victory in blood. For weeks, the Soviet sector was the only law in Berlin. Even after the Americans, British, and French arrived, the eastern half of the city remained firmly under Moscow's shadow. For Berliners who lived there, Soviet rule was unlike anything they had known before, a mix of harsh punishment, ideological re-education, and survival under fear. The Soviet mindset, the Soviets came to Berlin not as liberators but as conquerors. Their empire had been ravaged by Hitler's invasion. Millions dead, cities burned, families tore apart. For them, Berlin was not just a city, it was the enemy's nest, and every brick was a reminder of the war's horrors. That sense of vengeance shaped Soviet occupation policy. The Red Army seized factories, machinery, and entire railcars of goods to ship back to the Soviet Union. Reparations were not just financial, they were physical. Berlin's wealth, from cars to typewriters, was stripped and sent east. For civilians, this meant daily life in the Soviet zone began with loss. Fear in the streets, the most terrifying reality was the mass arrests. Soviet security forces, the NKVD, prowled the streets, pulling suspected Nazis, informants, or simply anyone who looked suspicious into trucks. Some were guilty of war crimes, many were not. Families watched loved ones vanish, often without trial, never to return. Rumors spread quickly. Men were being deported to Siberia. Former Wehrmacht officers disappeared. Entire neighborhoods lived in dread of a knock at the door after midnight. Even ordinary Berliners, with no political ties, lived under suspicion. One careless word could be reported by a neighbor, leading to arrest. Women and the wounds of war. The most painful chapter of Soviet occupation was the violence against women. During the first weeks after victory, widespread sexual assaults occurred, leaving a deep scar on the city's memory. Though Soviet commanders eventually cracked down on their soldiers, the damage was done. Women carried the trauma silently, forced to return to daily survival while bearing invisible wounds. Many gave birth to children months later, the so-called Russenkinder Russian children, living reminders of the violence. For East Berlin, these scars lingered for decades. Rebuilding through control, yet alongside punishment came reconstruction, but on Soviet terms. The Soviets encouraged Berliners to form Antifa, anti-fascist, committees to purge Nazis and promote socialism. Factories were reopened under strict Soviet supervision. Schools introduced new lessons glorifying communism, with portraits of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin replacing Hitler. In the cultural sphere, Soviet influence spread quickly. Russian literature was translated and distributed. Soviet soldiers staged plays and concerts. Posters showed heroic workers raising red flags over ruins, proclaiming that a new socialist Berlin was rising. To some Berliners, this was inspiring. To others, it was suffocating. Survival under Soviet watch food distribution was tightly controlled in the Soviet sector. Bread, potatoes, and soup were rationed, often in smaller portions than in the West. Many Berliners joked bitterly that the Soviets gave them victory soup, thin broth that barely filled the stomach. Still, some saw opportunities. Those who joined the new communist-led administration often received better rations. Families with Red Army connections could secure extra coal or food. Survival sometimes meant loyalty, or at least the appearance of it. East Berlin takes shape by late 1945. East Berlin had become distinctly different from the rest of the city. Soviet flags hung from government buildings. Red Army patrols marched through Alexanderplatz. Propaganda posters plastered walls, urging workers to rebuild for a socialist future. The ruins remained, but under the rubble, a new political order was being laid, one that would grow stronger with each passing year. For Berliners in the Soviet zone, life was survival under watchful eyes, a daily balance of silence, obedience, and quiet resistance. But while East Berlin lived under harsh control, the western sectors offered a very different experience. To cross westward was to step into another world, one filled with jazz, chocolate, and freedom, though not without its own struggles. American influence, jazz, chocolate, and democracy. If East Berlin was a world of suspicion and control, the American sector offered something that seemed almost unreal in the ruins of 1945: hope. To many Berliners, crossing into the U.S. zone felt like stepping onto another planet. There was still rubble, hunger, and loss, but there's also a taste of freedom, and sometimes the sweet smell of chocolate. The first encounter with GI's American soldiers arrived in Berlin in July 1945. Their presence was impossible to miss. Young men in clean uniforms, chewing gum, handing out cigarettes, and smiling in a way few Berliners had seen in years. For children, the Americans became heroes instantly. GIs tossed chocolate bars, chewing gum, and canned goods to kids crowding the sidewalks. To a generation raised on war and famine, these small gifts felt like miracles. Berliners nicknamed American chocolate the taste of freedom. Feeding the hungry, the U.S. military quickly recognized that food was a weapon as powerful as any tank. In their sector, ration distribution was stricter, but often more generous than in the Soviet zone. American kitchens served Ghoulish Cannonen, field soup kitchens where Berliners lined up for hot meals. For many families, this was the first real food they'd eaten in months. The Americans also introduced care packages sent by U.S. citizens to German families. Inside were luxuries Berliners hadn't seen in years: coffee, sugar, powdered milk, even chocolate cake mix. To receive one was like opening a treasure chest. The sounds of jazz beyond food, the Americans brought culture. Jazz bands played in makeshift clubs. Radio stations broadcast swing, big band, and blues. For Berlin youth, this was liberation through music. After years of Nazi bans on degenerate American jazz, the sound of trumpets and saxophones filled dance halls again. Teenagers in tattered shoes tried jitterbugging in ruined basements. Soldiers and civilians shared the dance floor, united by rhythm. The Soviets saw it as cultural corruption, but to many Berliners, jazz was the sound of life returning. Schools and democracy. The U.S. occupation also aimed to reshape German minds. Schools in the American sector introduced new curricula focused on democracy, civic responsibility, and critical thinking. Teachers with Nazi ties were removed, and young Germans were exposed to American ideals of free speech and open debate. It wasn't easy. Years of propaganda had left scars, and suspicion lingered. But slowly, classrooms began to feel less like places of indoctrination and more like places of discussion. The allure of the American dream. Berliners couldn't ignore the stark contrast between Soviet and American worlds. In East Berlin, propaganda showed workers carrying hammers under red banners. In West Berlin, you could walk into an American-run theater and watch a Hollywood film. Children collected American chewing gum wrappers like treasure. Women sought jobs with U.S. forces, where pay often came in cigarettes and food. Black market traders followed GIs, buying their supplies and reselling them across the city. Even with rationing, hunger, and unemployment, the American sector radiated possibility. It was imperfect, but it was freer. A divided experience, of course. Not all Berliners welcomed the Americans. Some resented their power, their wealth, their casual dominance in a broken city. Former Nazis muttered about humiliation, but for the younger generation, the attraction was undeniable. In the American zone, you didn't just survive, you glimpsed a different future. East Berlin marched to the beat of Soviet drums. West Berlin began to sway to the rhythm of American jazz. And in between, Berliners crossed daily, comparing rations, comparing freedoms, comparing futures. But the Western story wasn't only American. To the north, another power left its mark. The British, with their own approach, stern, disciplined, and quietly influential. British order, discipline, law, and reconstruction. If the American sector of Berlin was full of jazz and chewing gum, the British zone carried a different atmosphere altogether. The Union Jack flew over a city of discipline, structure, and restraint. To many Berliners, the British presence felt less flashy than the Americans, less harsh than the Soviets, but unmistakably firm. The British weren't there to charm or entertain. They were there to impose order and to rebuild. The arrival of the British troops entered Berlin in July 1945, joining the other Allies in carving up the city. Their zone stretched across the western districts, encompassing working-class neighborhoods, industrial sites, and stretches of ruined housing. The first task was simple: restore law and order. After months of looting, violence, and chaos, British patrols brought a level of control. Soldiers marched the streets, not with the swagger of American GIs, but with the stern efficiency of men determined to enforce the rules. For Berliners, that meant stability, but also scrutiny. The rule of discipline. The British sector was governed by strict regulations. Curfews were enforced carefully, black market trading was monitored, and anyone caught violating orders faced swift consequences. But there was fairness, too. Unlike the Soviets, the British occupation forces established clear rules for rationing, policing, and justice. Civilian courts reopened under their supervision. German police were retrained and rearmed to restore authority, though always under British oversight. Many Berliners quietly appreciated this balance. After years of Nazi dictatorship and months of chaos, the British brought a sense of predictable structure. Feeding the population. Food shortages were severe in the British zone, as in the rest of Berlin. Rations rarely satisfied hunger, and malnutrition was common. But the British prioritized fairness. Distribution was carefully recorded, and corruption was harshly punished. They also promoted community kitchens, where Berliners could receive hot meals. Though portions were small, the reliability of British rationing gave civilians a measure of security. Still, hunger never disappeared. Berliners often joked that in the British zone, you would never starve, but you would never feel full either. Reconstruction efforts. The British were methodical in their approach to rebuilding. Factories were surveyed, infrastructure mapped, and housing slowly restored. They emphasized utility over spectacle. Bridges were repaired, water and power systems restarted, and rubble cleared in organized phases. The British also brought technical expertise. Engineers and planners worked with German teams to stabilize neighborhoods, not just for survival, but for long-term recovery. Where the Americans emphasized generosity and the Soviets imposed ideology, the British built systems. Culture and entertainment. British culture also left its mark. The BBC broadcast news and educational programs into Berlin, promoting democratic values and English language learning. Theaters reopened under British supervision, staging Shakespeare plays alongside German classics. British military bands performed concerts, and Berliners, though hungry, flocked to hear live music again. The British even introduced soccer matches between their soldiers and local teams, sparking a tradition that helped normalize daily life. The British personality. To Berliners, the British seemed distant, sometimes cold, but generally fair. They weren't as approachable as the Americans, nor as frightening as the Soviets. Their officers maintained formality, often seen sipping tea amid the ruins. This air of composure, maintaining traditions even in a shattered city, impressed some Berliners. It showed that life could retain dignity, even after devastation. A quiet influence, though less dramatic than American glamour or Soviet might. The British impact was profound. They restored order, laid foundations for reconstruction, and introduced a steadiness that many Berliners desperately needed. One Berliner later recalled, "The Soviets terrified us. The Americans dazzled us. The British, they steadied us." But Berlin wasn't divided only into three parts. In the north, a smaller but still important sector carried its own style. French pride, suspicion, and a determination to assert cultural influence. French control, a smaller but proud sector compared to the Americans, Soviets, and British. The French presence in Berlin might have seemed modest. Their sector, carved out of the northern districts, including parts of Reunification and Wedding, was the smallest of all. But the French came with a determination that far outweighed their numbers. They had suffered humiliation under German occupation during the war, and now, in Berlin, they were determined to restore national pride and make their voice heard. The struggle to join the occupation initially, the French weren't even part of the plan. The Big Three, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, divided Berlin into three zones. But Charles de Gaulle, France's leader, demanded a seat at the table. France had been invaded, occupied, and humiliated by Germany in 1940. To rebuild its prestige, it had to be recognized as a victorious power. Reluctantly, the Allies agreed. A portion of the British and American zones was cut out and handed to the French. In July 1945, French troops marched into their new sector, determined to prove they belonged among the great powers. A small but symbolic zone, the French zone was smaller, poorer, and less strategically important than the others. It lacked the major industrial sites or central districts of the city. But that didn't matter to the French. For them, the symbolism was everything. Their flag flying over Berlin was proof that France had returned to the ranks of the victors. Berliners living in the French zone quickly noticed the difference. French patrols were fewer in number, but they carried themselves with sharp pride. Their uniforms, their accents, their tricolor flags, all announced that France was not broken. Administration and control of the French sector was governed with a mix of caution and suspicion. Having lived under German occupation just a few years earlier, many French officers carried bitterness toward Berliners. They imposed strict controls, especially on former Nazis, and were often slower to forgive or integrate Germans into local administration compared to the British or Americans. At the same time, the French opened schools, distributed rations, and worked to restore basic services. They leaned heavily on cultural influence as a way to assert control. French culture in the Rubble, where the Americans brought jazz and the British brought Shakespeare, the French brought art, literature, and cinema. Cafes reopened in the French zone, where Berliners could sip weak coffee or wine if they could afford it. French officers sponsored film screenings of classics, art exhibitions, and lectures. To them, spreading French culture was as important as distributing food. Some Berliners welcomed it as a breath of refinement in a ruined city. Others saw it as distant, even elitist compared to the practical aid of the Americans or British. Rations and daily life food distribution in the French zone was often tighter than in the others. Supplies were limited, and French authorities were cautious. Berliners sometimes joked that in the French zone, you might get culture before you got bread. Still, the French also participated in the larger Allied efforts to feed and stabilize the city. Like in the other sectors, barter and black market trading remained essential. A proud but isolated power, the French presence in Berlin was both proud and precarious. They lacked the military strength of the Soviets, the economic power of the Americans, or the organizational reach of the British. But what they had was determination. Flying their flag in Berlin, even over a small sector, was proof that France had survived the war, reclaimed its dignity, and would shape Europe's future. For Berliners, life under the French was stricter in some ways, more cultured in others. but always marked by the pride of a nation that had once been defeated and now stood tall again. But Berlin itself was changing. For zones, for armies, for governments, and one city caught in the middle. And as 1945 gave way to 1946, those differences began to sharpen into something far more dangerous. The birth of a divided city, tensions among the Allies in the summer of 1945, the world celebrated the end of the most destructive war in history. Berlin was shattered, but there was hope that the Allies, victors united against fascism, could rebuild both Germany and peace itself. For a brief moment, the four flags flying over Berlin symbolized unity. But beneath the surface, cracks were already spreading. The Allied partnership that had defeated Hitler was not built on friendship, but on necessity. And in Berlin, that uneasy alliance began to unravel. The spirit of Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the leaders of the Allied powers, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, later replaced by Attlee, met to decide the future of Germany. They agreed on the basics. Germany would be demilitarized, denazified, and divided into zones of occupation. Berlin itself, though inside the Soviet zone, would be shared among all four powers. On paper, it sounded like cooperation. In reality, each side already had different visions. The Soviets wanted reparations, security, and a Germany firmly under their control. The Americans sought to rebuild Germany as a democracy and economic partner. The British focused on maintaining order and balancing power in Europe. The French, still scarred from occupation, pushed for punishment and protection. Berlin became the testing ground for these competing goals. The Four-Power Council to manage the city. The Allies created the Allied Kommandantur, a joint governing council with representatives from all four powers. Decisions had to be unanimous. In theory, this ensured cooperation. In practice, it guaranteed conflict. Every issue, from ration distribution to rebuilding police forces, turned into a tug of war. The Soviets blocked proposals they disliked. The Western Allies resisted Soviet demands. Meetings often ended in shouting matches with little decided. Berliners quickly realized that their lives were being shaped not by unity, but by rivalry. Everyday signs of division, the differences between sectors grew clearer with each passing month. In the Soviet zone, propaganda filled the streets, praising socialism and attacking Western imperialists. Food was scarce, arrests were common, and loyalty to the new communist order was demanded. In the American sector, theaters played Hollywood films, schools taught democratic values, and aid programs distributed food and supplies. The British zone emphasized structure and law, cautious but steady. The French sector remained stricter and smaller, focused on asserting cultural influence. Berliners began to talk about crossing the border, even though it was still invisible. Each zone felt like a different country. Seeds of distrust, the Allies no longer trusted one another. Stalin accused the West of trying to rebuild Germany as a weapon against the Soviet Union. Truman and Churchill warned that Soviet control threatened all of Europe. In Berlin, these fears played out daily. Soviet officers monitored Western movements. Western soldiers documented Soviet actions. Spies, informants, and secret police flourished. The city became a chessboard for global power. The people caught in the middle for Berliners. This growing tension was exhausting. All they wanted was food, stability, and peace. Instead, they found themselves living in a city that was becoming the first battleground of the Cold War. One Berliner later recalled, "We thought the war was over, but soon we realized another kind of war had already begun." Berlin had survived bombing, siege, and conquest. Now it faced something new, the slow, invisible war of ideology and influence. And the first major test of this fragile peace was already looming, as denazification efforts exposed the impossible question: how could Germany be rebuilt when so many of its people had served the Nazi system? Denazification, purging the past or protecting the future. Berlin in 1945 was a city filled with ruins, not just of buildings, but of a society that had lived under Hitler's rule for 12 years. When the Allies arrived, they faced a dilemma. Nearly every institution, from schools to police forces, had been tied to the Nazi regime. Millions of ordinary Germans had been party members. So how do you rebuild a nation when almost everyone had some connection to the old system? That was the challenge of denazification. The Allied goal each of the 4 Allied powers agreed in principle. Nazism had to be rooted out completely. Former party members, SS officers, and Nazi officials would be removed from positions of power. War criminals would face justice. A new, democratic Germany would rise from the ashes. But there was a problem. Germany wasn't just dotted with Nazis. Nazism had been woven into everyday life. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, police officers, even postal clerks had all been required to join party organizations. To purge them all would mean paralyzing the country. Soviet approach. Harsh and political in East Berlin, the Soviets moved quickly and ruthlessly. Former Nazis were arrested, deported, or executed. Entire professions were purged, especially teachers and officials. But the Soviets weren't just cleansing the past. They were reshaping the future. Positions vacated by Nazis were filled with loyal communists. Denazification became a tool not just to punish, but to build a socialist state. For many East Berliners, survival meant keeping silent about their past and showing loyalty to the new order. American approach. Thorough but flexible, the Americans initially tried to be systematic. They introduced questionnaires called Fragebogen, which asked Germans about their past affiliations. Millions of Berliners filled them out, declaring their innocence or confessing minor involvement. But the process quickly bogged down. Too many people had been involved, too many cases to process. If every former Nazi was removed, there would be no teachers left to run schools, no doctors in hospitals, no engineers to rebuild power plants. Gradually, the Americans became more pragmatic. They punished high-ranking Nazis, but allowed many lower-level members to return to work. British and French approaches. The British were pragmatic from start. They focused on removing dangerous figures, but allowed others back into their professions, reasoning that survival and stability mattered most. The French, scarred by their own experience of Nazi occupation, were stricter. In their sector, they were often harsher in punishing collaborators and slower to reinstate Germans into positions of authority. The Nuremberg trials denazification wasn't just a local policy. It became a global spectacle with the Nuremberg trials in late 1945. Top Nazi leaders were brought before an international tribunal to face charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. For Berliners, the trials were broadcast as a signal. The Nazi elite would be held accountable. But for ordinary people, questions remained. What about the millions who had followed orders but weren't leaders? Could they all be punished? Should they be? The human side of purging for Berlin families, denazification was personal. A father who had once been a Nazi official might now be barred from work. A mother who had taught in a Nazi school might lose her job. Families often lived in fear of exposure, of neighbors reporting past affiliations. Some Berliners were genuinely relieved to see former Nazis punished. Others felt it was unfair, that ordinary people had no choice but to participate. And many simply wondered, how long can this go on? When will we be allowed to live again? Purge or practicality? By late 1946, denazification in Berlin was already losing steam. The Western Allies realized they needed German expertise to rebuild, especially as Cold War tensions grew. The Soviets had already replaced Nazis with communists. What began as a purge slowly transformed into a balancing act between justice and practicality. Berliners came to see denazification not as justice, but as politics. Who was punished and who was spared depended less on morality and more on which sector you lived in. Denazification had started with the promise of cleansing Germany of its darkest past. But in Berlin, it soon became clear the city's future would be shaped less by the past and more by the growing rivalry of the present. And as Berlin struggled with questions of justice, another threat loomed that united everyone, no matter the sector: the desperate fight against hunger. Hunger and survival. Berlin's harsh winter. If Berliners thought the end of the war would bring relief, the winter of 1945 to 46 proved them wrong. Hunger became the city's greatest enemy. Bombs and bullets had stopped, but now cold and empty stomachs threatened lives just as cruelly. The empty shelves, Germany's agricultural system, had collapsed. Fields lay untended, livestock had been slaughtered, and transportation networks were shattered. What little food existed was often sent away as reparations, especially from the Soviet zone. In Berlin, ration cards promised meager supplies, sometimes only 1,000 calories a day, half of what a healthy adult needed. Bread was black, thin, and often stretched with fillers like sawdust or ground acorns. Meat was almost non-existent. Butter and sugar were luxuries few ever saw. For families, every meal was a battle. Mothers watered down soup to make it last longer. Children scavenged for scraps in garbage bins behind Allied mess halls. The cold of ruins, as if hunger weren't enough, coal was also scarce. With infrastructure destroyed and winter temperatures dropping, Berliners froze in their ruined apartments. Families huddled together under blankets, burning furniture, books, even doors to stay warm. Those who ventured into the forests outside the city to cut firewood risked arrest by patrols or attacks by desperate thieves. The city was not just starving. It was shivering to death. Black market lifeline, the official ration system, could not sustain life. That's why the black market became the beating heart of survival. At Potsdamer Platz, Alexanderplatz, and other squares, Berliners traded anything they had. A gold watch might buy a sack of potatoes. A family heirloom could be exchanged for coal. Cigarettes, especially American ones, were the currency of the city. Children learned to barter with speed and cunning. Housewives carried hidden goods under coats. Even Allied soldiers sometimes sold rations for extra cash. Without the black market, tens of thousands more would have perished. Aid arrives. Slowly the Western Allies, especially the Americans, try to send relief supplies. Care packages from the United States gave lucky families a taste of survival. Powdered milk, sugar, coffee, chocolate. To open one was to remember that the world outside hadn't forgotten them. But the scale of Berlin's hunger was overwhelming. Relief shipments could not match the sheer need of millions of people. The Soviets, meanwhile, often prioritized shipments back to Russia over feeding Berliners. In their sector, food shortages were especially severe. For many East Berliners, survival meant crossing secretly into the West to barter or beg. Children in hunger, the youngest, suffered most. Thin, pale, and sickly, many children developed rickets and malnutrition. Schools opened soup kitchens, but portions were too small. Teachers reported students fainting during lessons. And yet, children also displayed the greatest resilience. They scavenged, begged, and even charmed Allied soldiers for scraps of food. For them, a piece of chocolate or a spoonful of jam was more precious than gold. A city holding on by the end of winter, Berlin had survived barely. Hunger had weakened the population, but it hadn't broken them. Berliners learned to endure, to stretch crumbs into meals, to laugh bitterly at their misery. One Berliner later recalled, "We had nothing. We ate potato peels, weeds from the parks, anything we could find. But we lived, and as long as we lived, we believed we could rebuild." Hunger united Berliners across sectors. But soon, survival would no longer be just about food. It would become about freedom, ideology, and which side of the city's invisible border you trusted more. The next chapter of Berlin's story would be written not in empty bowls, but in the growing shadow of a new war. The Cold War begins. Ideology in the Rubble Berlin in 1946 was more than just a ruined capital. It had become the front line of a new global struggle. On the surface, Allied unity still held. Americans, British, French, and Soviets all sat on the Allied Commandatura, jointly governing the city. But underneath, trust was crumbling fast. The rubble of Berlin was no longer just about rebuilding. It was about reshaping, and each side wanted to mold Germany into its own image. Soviet vision. a socialist Berlin, the Soviets moved quickly to expand their influence in East Berlin. They supported the merger of communist and socialist parties into the SED, Socialist Unity Party, which soon dominated political life in their sector. Newspapers, schools, and cultural programs were infused with Marxist ideology. Land was redistributed, industries seized, and secret police quietly began watching the population. The message was clear. The future of East Berlin would be socialist, loyal to Moscow. Western vision, a democratic Berlin in the West, the Americans and British took a different approach. They encouraged the revival of non-communist political parties, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, liberals. They supported newspapers that promoted free speech and pluralism. Radio became a powerful weapon. The Americans launched Rundfunk im Amerikanischen Sektor, RIS, a station broadcasting democratic ideals, jazz music, and news and censor by communist filters. For Berliners, it was more than entertainment. It was a lifeline to the outside world. Propaganda wore the streets of Berlin became a battlefield of posters, rallies, and leaflets. In the East, slogans promised equality and justice under socialism. In the West, messages stressed freedom, democracy, and ties to the wider world. Ordinary Berliners found themselves caught in the middle. Every choice, what newspaper you read, which rally you attended, which radio station you listened to, carried weight. The Iron Curtain speech in March 1946, Winston Churchill declared in his famous Iron Curtain speech that Eastern Europe was falling under Soviet domination. Berliners felt the truth of those words every day. The city, divided into 4 zones, was already becoming a microcosm of the Cold War. 2 worlds, 2 visions, colliding in the same ruined streets. Suspicion and spies. Berlin swarmed with spies. Every cafe might host informants. Every street corner might hold agents watching who met with whom. Both the Soviets and the Western Allies recruited Germans as informants, making trust between neighbors almost impossible. For Berliners, daily life became a balancing act. A wrong word in the East could bring a midnight knock on the door. In the West, suspicion of communist sympathies could cost someone their job. A city between worlds, Berlin was technically one city, but in reality, it was already 2. Crossing from east to west could feel like stepping into another universe. Different newspapers, different slogans, different police. And yet, people still moved freely between sectors. Families visited each other across the lines. Workers commuted daily from one side to the other. No wall existed. Not yet. But the seeds were being planted. The coming storm for now, Berliners endured, clinging to survival. But the question was no longer just about food, coal, or rebuilding. It was about who would own Berlin's soul. Would it belong to Moscow with its socialist order, or to Washington and London with their vision of freedom and democracy? The Rubble was turning into a stage for the world's greatest ideological showdown. And soon, that struggle would explode into crisis, with Berlin itself at the very center. Dividing the city, East versus West policies. By 1947, Berlin had become more than a ruined capital. It was a laboratory for the future of Europe. The 4 victorious powers still sat around the same tables in the Allied Commandatura, but their policies were pulling the city apart. What began as differences in Reconstruction soon hardened into 2 competing systems of life. Soviet policies in the East. The Soviets wasted no time in reshaping their sector into a socialist stronghold. Land reform. Large estates were confiscated and broken up, handed to small farmers who were encouraged to align with the new socialist order. Industry. Factories were dismantled and shipped to the USSR as reparations. Those that remained were nationalized under state control. Education. Textbooks were rewritten, teachers re-educated, and curricula adjusted to emphasize Marxism and anti-fascist ideology. For ordinary East Berliners, daily life became tightly regulated. Every aspect, from schools to theaters, was infused with political messaging. Western policies in the West, in contrast, the Americans, British, and eventually the French promoted a very different vision. Democracy. Political parties flourished, including the Christian Democrats Social Democrats, and liberals. Economic recovery. The West began experimenting with free market practices, slowly reviving shops, small businesses, and trade. Cultural freedom. Newspapers and radio stations were allowed to debate openly, criticizing both the past and present. In the Western sectors, despite shortages, there was a sense of openness and possibility, a taste of a future not tied to dictatorship. A Tale of Two Berlins by 1947, a Berliner could see the differences firsthand. In the East, posters of Stalin and SED slogans cover the walls. Rallies called for socialist unity. The police, increasingly modeled after the Soviet NKVD, kept a close watch. In the West, jazz music spilled from cafes, RIS radio mocked Soviet propaganda, and people whispered about American chocolate and British cigarettes. The contrast was stark. Though rubble still dominated both landscapes, the seeds of two different cities were sprouting from the ruins. Political clashes, the Allied Kommandatura, once a symbol of unity, became a battleground. The Soviets vetoed proposals for a free press. The Americans pushed for economic reforms. The French demanded strict controls on German industry, fearing a revived militarism. Meetings often descended into shouting matches. Cooperation, once vital for rebuilding, was breaking apart. Berliners caught in the middle. For ordinary Berliners, this division was bewildering. Families often lived in one sector and worked in another. A child might go to school in the West, but visit relatives in the East. At first, many hoped the differences were temporary, that unity would return. But by 1947, whispers began: Berlin will be split forever. The larger picture of the division in Berlin mirrored global events. The Truman Doctrine had been announced in 1947, promising American aid to nations resisting communism. The Marshall Plan was being drafted, offering billions in reconstruction funds to Western Europe. The Soviets saw these moves as threats, attempts to buy loyalty and isolate the East. Berlin, sitting inside Soviet-controlled territory, but with Western sectors at its heart, became the perfect stage for confrontation. The line in the rubble, there was no wall yet. No barbed wire, just invisible lines dividing neighborhoods, streets, even buildings. But those lines were growing sharper, and soon they would no longer just be political. They would become economic, a clash over money, value, and the very future of Germany's survival. The currency crisis, clash over the Deutsche Mark. Berlin in 1948 was a city running not only on hunger and rubble, but on worthless paper. The old Reichsmark, once the backbone of Hitler's empire, had collapsed. Inflation, shortages, and the black market made it nearly useless. People carried stacks of bills to buy a loaf of bread, if they could even find one. Cigarettes, chocolate, and coffee were far more reliable currencies than money itself. Everyone knew the situation couldn't last, but how the Allies chose to fix it would shatter what little cooperation remained. The problem of worthless money, the Reichsmark, had no real value anymore. Prices skyrocketed, goods disappeared from legal shops, and bartering replaced buying. Doctors were paid in potatoes, teachers in cigarettes, laborers in coal. Berliners joked bitterly that their currency was worth less than the paper it was printed on. But the joke masked real suffering. Without stable money, rebuilding was impossible. Western plans for reform, the Americans, British, and French decided to act. In secret, they prepared a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, DM. Unlike the Reichsmark, it would be backed by real economic planning and tied to Western recovery efforts, including the Marshall Plan. The idea was simple: give Germans a fresh start with a currency that had value. Shops would reopen. Farmers would sell their food instead of hoarding it. Factories could pay workers again. But for the Soviets, the plan was seen as a direct threat. Soviet opposition, the Soviets insisted that currency reform must be done jointly, under four-power control. They feared the West's Deutsche Mark would pull Germany, and especially Berlin, firmly into the Western orbit. For Stalin, money wasn't just economics. It was power. Whoever controlled Germany's currency would control its future. So when the West announced the introduction of the Deutsche Mark in their sectors in June 1948, the Soviets struck back. Currency chaos in Berlin overnight. Berliners saw two currencies circulating in one city. In the West, the new Deutsche Mark appeared, crisp and trusted. Within days, shop shelves began to refill, goods reappeared, and black market prices fell. In the East, the Soviets pushed their own version of the Reichsmark, stamped to prevent circulation into the West. But it carried little confidence. People rushed to trade them for the Western mark whenever possible. Families living on one street suddenly found their money worth half as much as their neighbors. East Berliners secretly crossed into the West to exchange savings. Markets swelled with tension as traders whispered, "Marks from the West or East?" A city split by money, the introduction of the Deutsche Mark did more than stabilize the Western economy. It drew a visible line through Berlin. In the West, confidence grew. The new mark meant stability, opportunity, a sense of progress. In the East, resentment and suspicion spread. The Soviets accused the West of betrayal, of breaking four-power agreements, of preparing Germany to be their ally in a new conflict. Money, more than tanks or speeches, had just created the first real fracture between East and West Berlin. Stalin's next move for Stalin, this was unacceptable. He could not allow the West to plant a stable, democratic economy in the heart of his occupied zone. So he decided to act. If the West wanted to keep Berlin, they would have to fight for it. Not with guns, but with survival itself. And that decision would set off one of the most dramatic crises of the Cold War. The Berlin Blockade. Stalin strikes back on June 24, 1948. Berliners awoke to find their city suddenly cut off. Roads leading west were blocked. Rail lines were halted. Barges on canals were stopped. Even electricity supplied from Soviet-controlled plants was switched off. The Soviet Union had launched the Berlin Blockade, a bold gamble to drive the Western Allies out of Berlin once and for all. Stalin's calculated move, Stalin's strategy was simple but ruthless. Choke the city into submission. Berlin sat 100 miles inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. The western sectors survived only through tenuous supply lines from the west. By closing them, Stalin believed the Americans, British, and French would have no choice but to abandon the city. With no food, no fuel, and no way out, Berlin would fall quietly into Soviet hands. Or so he thought. Berliners under siege almost overnight. Berlin became an island under siege. The 2.5 million people in the western sectors faced starvation. Without coal, there would be no heat. Without flour, no bread. Without fuel, no light. Berliners who had just begun to rebuild after years of war now faced the terrifying prospect of another collapse. Mothers stood in ration lines that suddenly had nothing to offer. Children went to bed in darkness. The message from the Soviets was clear: leave. Berlin belongs to us. Western response, but the West refused to give up. U.S. President Harry Truman and British Prime Minister Clement Attlee agreed. If Berlin fell, all of Europe might follow. To retreat would be to admit defeat in the first great test of the Cold War. Yet the challenge was enormous. To keep Berlin alive, they would need to supply an entire city, food, coal, medicine, everything, without using land routes. There was only one option left: the air. The airlift plan at first, the idea seemed impossible. Could planes really feed an entire city? Military planners calculated that Berlin needed at least 4,500 tons of supplies every day to survive. But desperation breeds innovation. American and British commanders began organizing a massive operation. Transport aircraft, mostly C-47s and C-54s, would fly supplies from West Germany into Berlin's three western airfields: Tempelhof, Gatto, and Tegel. It would mean planes landing every few minutes, day and night, without pause. Failure would mean starvation. Success would defy Stalin himself. The spirit of resistance for Berliners, the blockade, was terrifying, but it also ignited defiance. Instead of blaming the Allies, most citizens stood with them. Crowds cheered at the sight of planes landing. Children waved flags as crates of coal, and food were unloaded. One Berliner later recalled, "We had nothing, but when we saw those planes, we knew we were not alone." A gamble becomes a battle. The Berlin blockade was more than a local crisis. It was the first real battle of the Cold War, not fought with bullets, but with willpower. If Stalin succeeded, he would prove the West could not protect Europe. If the Allies succeeded, they would prove that freedom could survive even in the darkest of circumstances. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic air operations in history, an operation that would become known simply as the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift. Feeding a city by sky, when the first supply planes rumbled into Berlin in late June 1948. No one knew if the plan would work. Could an entire city of 2.5 million people be kept alive by air alone? Most thought it was madness. But the people of Berlin, staring at empty shells and dark apartments, clung to the roar of engines overhead as a sound of hope. Operation Vittles, the Americans called it Operation Vittles. The British named theirs Operation Plainfare, but to Berliners, it became something much greater. The Luftbrücke, the air bridge. Day and night, aircraft flew in endless waves. From bases in West Germany, they lifted off with loads of flour, powdered milk, coal, medicine, and fuel. They landed at Berlin's airfields with precision timing, often less than 3 minutes apart. The logistics were staggering. Runways had to be repaired, air traffic control systems modernized, and crews rotated constantly. But determination pushed the operation forward. The numbers behind the miracle at its peak, more than 1,400 flights per day, soared into Berlin. Cargo included 1,000 tons of flour and food daily, 3,500 tons of coal per day. During winter, thousands of gallons of fuel and medicine over the course of 11 months. The airlift delivered more than 2.3 million tons of supplies, enough to keep the city alive. The sight of planes stacked in the sky, circling for landing, became so familiar that Berliners joked the pigeons had to file flight plans. Human touch. The candy bomber among the countless pilots. One stood out. Gail Halvorsen, an American airman who began dropping small parachutes of candy to children waiting near the runways. His act of kindness spread quickly. Soon, thousands of candy bars were donated, and pilots joined in the effort. To the children of Berlin, the candy bomber was more than a sweet surprise. He was proof that someone cared, that the world had not abandoned them. Soviet frustration. Stalin watched the airlift with growing frustration. He had expected the Western Allies to abandon Berlin within weeks. Instead, they turned the blockade into a rallying cry. The Soviets tried harassment, buzzing Allied planes with fighters, spreading propaganda that the airlift would fail. But they never dared shoot down a plane, fearing war with the West. Every successful landing at Tempelhof or Gatow was a direct message to Moscow. Berlin would not be surrendered. Life in the airlift city for Berliners. Life during the airlift was both grim and inspiring. They still endured rationing, cold winters, and constant shortages. Coal dust blackened their faces as families rationed every briquette. Children lined the fences at Tempelhof, cheering as planes landed, dreaming of catching a candy parachute. The airlift became more than survival. It became a symbol of freedom. Berliners knew they were the frontline soldiers in a new kind of war. A turning point as weeks turned into months. The impossible became routine. The airlift had not only kept Berlin alive, it had become a triumph of logistics, courage, and willpower. The West had shown it would not be pushed out. Stalin, facing humiliation, would soon have to decide, escalate or back down. And his decision would mark the first great victory of the Cold War. Breaking the blockade, Stalin backs down by the spring of 1949. The sound of Allied planes landing at Tempelhof, Gatow, and Tegel had become the heartbeat of West Berlin. The city was alive, defiant, and refusing to starve. What Stalin had thought would be a quick victory had turned into a year-long embarrassment. The Berlin blockade was failing. The limits of the blockade, the Soviets had expected the West to give up. Instead, the airlift not only worked but grew stronger with each month. By April 1949, planes were landing with such precision that more supplies were entering West Berlin than had ever come by rail before the blockade. Stalin's weapon, hunger, had been blunted. The blockade was no longer pressuring the West. It was humiliating Moscow. Political cost for the Soviets, the blockade had unintended consequences. Far from weakening Western influence in Berlin, it strengthened it. Berliners saw the Western Allies not as occupiers, but as protectors. The Soviets, once hailed as liberators in 1945, were now seen as oppressors. The propaganda war was lost. Stalin's attempt to starve Berlin had united the West instead of dividing it. Every candy drop, every sack of flour, every ton of coal brought in by air was a direct contrast to Soviet refusal to help. Western unity, the crisis, also bound the Western allies together. The US, Britain, and France realized that cooperation was the only way forward. Out of this unity came the foundations of NATO, a defensive alliance to protect Europe against future Soviet aggression. For Berliners, it meant the Western commitment was not temporary. The West was there to stay. Stalin's dilemma: by May 1949, Stalin faced a choice: escalate the crisis, risking war with the West, or admit defeat. Shooting down Allied planes was too dangerous. Maintaining the blockade was useless. On May 12, 1949, after 11 months, the Soviets lifted the blockade. Roads, railways, and canals reopened. Electricity flowed again. Berlin had survived. The victory of the airlift, the Western Allies had not just saved a city. They had scored the first major victory of the Cold War. The airlift proved that determination and logistics could defeat intimidation and force. For Berliners, the end of the blockade was celebrated in the streets, but it was also bittersweet. They knew the city was still divided, that the struggle between East and West was far from over. A divided future, though the blockade ended. Its legacy was clear. Berlin was no longer just a German city. It was the front line of the Cold War. Two worlds, two systems, two futures, both claiming the same city. And while Stalin had lost the battle of the blockade, he had not given up on Berlin. The next battles would not be about food or coal. They would be about power, identity, and the permanent division of the city itself. A city divided. The two Berlins emerged when the blockade ended in May 1949. The streets of Berlin echoed with relief. The roar of Allied planes had kept the city alive for nearly a year, and Stalin's gamble had failed. But beneath the celebration, Berliners sensed a deeper truth. Their city was no longer one. It was two. The birth of two German states. The blockade had done more than test Western resolve. It had accelerated Germany's political division. In May 1949, the Western Allies approved the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, in their zones, with Bonn as its capital. It was a democratic state aligned with the West. In October 1949, the Soviets responded by forming the German Democratic Republic, GDR, in their zone, with East Berlin as its capital. It was a socialist state aligned with Moscow. Berlin, though technically under four-power control, became the symbolic heart of both nations. West Berlin, an island of freedom in the western sectors, Berliners began to feel a cautious sense of hope. The new Deutsche Mark gave them economic stability. Shops reopened, businesses restarted, and cultural life slowly returned. West Berliners saw themselves as part of a new democratic Germany, tied to America, Britain, and France. Yet they also knew they were isolated, a small island of freedom surrounded by a sea of Soviet-controlled territory. Every tram ride to the edge of the city was a reminder. Just beyond lay the East, with its checkpoints and Soviet soldiers. East Berlin, a socialist capital in East Berlin, the Soviets moved quickly to consolidate control. The SED, Socialist Unity Party, became the dominant force. Elections were tightly managed, and dissent was silenced. Factories were nationalized, and political loyalty became as important as skill. The Soviet sector wasn't just rebuilding, it was reshaping itself into the model of a socialist state. Posters of Stalin decorated the streets, and May Day parades filled the boulevards with red flags and marching columns. For many, this promised stability after chaos. But for others, it felt like trading one dictatorship for another. Families and friends across the line, despite the political divide, Berliners still moved freely between East and West in 1949. Families visited relatives across the sectors, workers commuted daily, and shoppers searched for better prices on either side. The division was real, but it wasn't yet physical. There was no wall, no barbed wire, just different newspapers, different currencies, and different futures unfolding step by step. Symbol of a wider struggle, Berlin became more than a city. It became the stage of the Cold War itself. For the West, West Berlin was a beacon of freedom, proof that democracy could survive even behind the Iron Curtain. For the East, East Berlin was the capital of socialist Germany, proof that the Soviet system could rebuild from the ruins of fascism. The city was one body with two souls, each pulling in a different direction. A fragile peace, the airlift had ended the blockade, but not the rivalry. Berliners now lived with an uneasy calm. No bombs fell, no planes roared overhead, but everyone knew. The Cold War had only just begun, and their city was its most dangerous flashpoint. The refugee flood, East Germans escaped through Berlin by the early 1950s. Berlin was no longer just a divided city. It was an escape hatch. For millions trapped in East Germany, the open streets of Berlin offered a way out. As long as the city remained technically unified under four-power control, people could move freely between sectors. And they did, in staggering numbers. The Great Escape route, East Berliners could simply walk across into the western sectors without visas, papers, or border guards. From there, they could catch trains or flights into West Germany. It was the one place in the Soviet bloc where the Iron Curtain had a gap. Between 1949 and 1961, nearly 3.5 million East Germans fled to the west, many through Berlin. They were farmers, doctors, engineers, students, and families seeking freedom, opportunity, or simply food and stability. Each departure was more than just an escape. It was a silent vote of no confidence in the East German state. East Germany's brain drain for the GDR, the exodus was devastating. Those leaving were often the young, educated, and skilled, the very people needed to rebuild the economy. Factories lost engineers, hospitals lost doctors, schools lost teachers. Every family that fled weakened the socialist system. And every family that stayed asked the same question: should we leave too? Life in the East. Why they left East Berlin and the GDR promised equality, jobs, and stability. But the reality was different. Food shortages remained common. Political repression silenced dissent. Secret police, Stasi, watched citizens closely. Limited freedoms meant travel, speech, and even choice of job were often restricted. For many, life felt like a prison without walls. And Berlin was the one door still left open. West Berlin, a beacon in contrast. West Berlin became a symbol of possibility. Shops had goods, streets buzzed with jazz clubs and cinemas, and the Western Allies poured resources into making the city a showcase of freedom. RIS Radio, broadcasting from the American sector, encouraged listeners in the East. There is another way to live. For East Germans, a trip to West Berlin, even just for an afternoon, was enough to see the difference. The human stories, the refugee crisis wasn't just numbers. It was families divided in train stations, young students slipping across borders at night, and parents sending children ahead, hoping to follow later. Some walked out carrying only a suitcase. Others left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Each story carried both hope and heartbreak. Freedom gained, but home lost. Soviet and East German response. As the flood grew, East German leaders grew desperate. They tried propaganda campaigns, urging citizens to stay. They tightened controls on travel within the GDR. They even pressured the Soviets for permission to seal the border. But in the early 1950s, Berlin remained open, a gaping wound in the Iron Curtain, bleeding citizens day after day. A growing tension, the refugee flood through Berlin was more than a migration crisis. It was a humiliation for the East, proof to the world that communism could not hold its people. And as the numbers swelled, the East German regime, with Soviet backing, began to plan drastic measures to stop the hemorrhage. What came next would shock the world and leave scars on Berlin for decades. The uprising of 1953. Workers' revolt in East Berlin. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with whispers in factory halls and mutters in bread lines. By June 1953, the frustrations of East Berlin's workers had reached a breaking point. The promise of socialism, security, fairness, dignity had curdled into exhaustion, shortages, and fear. And then, suddenly, the people snapped. The spark of May 1953, East German leader Walter Ulbricht announced increased work quotas, demanding workers produce more for the same pay. For men already enduring food shortages, political repression, and long hours, this felt like betrayal. On June 16, 1953, construction workers on Berlin's Grand Stalinallee Boulevard went on strike. They put down their tools, marched through the city, and shouted a simple but dangerous demand: down with the quotas! By the afternoon, thousands of East Berliners had joined them. The protest had grown from a labor strike into a full-scale revolt. The protest word spread like wildfire. By June 17th, strikes and demonstrations erupted in over 500 towns across East Germany. Workers, students, and ordinary citizens filled the streets. Their chants were no longer just about quotas. They now demanded free elections, release of political prisoners, an end to Soviet control. It was no longer an economic protest. It was a cry for freedom. The Soviet response, the uprising, terrified the East German regime. The Stasi was still young and weak, and the East German police couldn't handle the swelling crowds. Ulbricht and his party turned to Moscow for help. The Soviets answered with tanks. On June 17th, T-34s rolled into East Berlin, their engines growling through the boulevards. Soldiers with rifles and machine guns surrounded protesters. When demonstrators refused to disperse, the Soviets opened fire. Shots cracked across the city. Smoke rose. The revolution was crushed in blood. Casualties and repression, the official numbers remain contested, but estimates suggest 50 to 125 people killed, hundreds wounded, thousands arrested. Those who survived carried scars of fear. The Stasi expanded, repression tightened, and Ulbricht clung to power with Soviet backing. For East Germans, the uprising became both a tragedy and a warning. Defiance was possible, but dangerous. The world watches in the West. The uprising caused shockwaves. Radio broadcasts covered the protests in real time. Newspapers printed photos of unarmed workers facing down Soviet tanks. But beyond words, the West could do little. West Berlin was close, just a short drive from the uprising. Yet American, British, and French forces stayed in their sectors, unwilling to risk all-out war with Moscow. For East Germans, this was a bitter truth. They were on their own. The legacy of 1953, though the revolt was crushed, it left a lasting mark. It showed the deep dissatisfaction within East Germany. It proved that Soviet control rested on force, not consent. It planted seeds of resistance that would resurface again. In 1956 in Hungary, in 1968 in Prague, and decades later in Berlin once more. For a moment, East Berliners had risen against the might of the Soviet Empire, and though they were silenced, the echo of their voices would not fade. The West reacts, propaganda, and support the crushing of the 1953 uprising sent shockwaves, not only through East Germany, but across the globe. In Washington, London, and Paris, leaders had watched in real time as ordinary workers rose up against Soviet rule, only to be silenced by tanks. Though the West did not intervene militarily, it quickly seized the moment to turn tragedy into a powerful weapon: propaganda. Radio Free Europe and the airwaves almost overnight. Western broadcasts grew sharper, louder, and more determined. Radio in the American sector, RIS, broadcasting from West Berlin, became the heartbeat of resistance. It covered the uprising extensively, reading out eyewitness testimonies and smuggled letters. Radio Free Europe, operating from Munich, blasted messages into the East, telling listeners, "You are not alone." The world has heard your cries. For East German authorities, these stations were poison. For East German citizens, they were hope. Radios became hidden lifelines, listened to quietly in kitchens with the volume low, curtains drawn, and hearts pounding. Leaflets, balloons, and the sky, the West also turned to creative methods to pierce the Iron Curtain. From the air, balloons released from West Germany floated eastward, carrying pamphlets and newspapers describing the truth about the uprising. Political cartoons mocking Soviet leaders. Even small packets of coffee, chocolate, and nylon stockings. Tangible reminders of the prosperity just beyond the border. Children in East German villages would chase these balloons, collecting fragments of another world. Aid and symbolism of the United States and its allies also increased material support to West Berlin, determined to show it as a beacon of freedom. More food shipments arrived, new cultural institutions were funded, and scholarships were offered for students. Every investment had a purpose, to contrast the vitality of the West with the repression of the East. In speeches, Western leaders hailed the East German workers as heroes. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower declared them brave men and women who fought for liberty. The message was clear. The West could not save them today, but their courage would not be forgotten. East German counterpropaganda, the East German regime fought back with its own narrative. Newspapers in the GDR described the uprising not as a workers' revolt, but as a fascist plot orchestrated by Western spies. Soviet-controlled media called the protesters bandits and traitors, claiming their deaths were necessary to protect socialism. But few in East Berlin believed this. They had seen their neighbors march. They had seen tanks fire. No newspaper headline could erase the truth. A Cold War battlefield of words in the months after 1953, Berlin became not just a divided city, but a propaganda battlefield. Loudspeakers were placed along the border, each side blaring music, speeches, and slogans across the divide. It was war by words, but the stakes were just as high. Every broadcast, every leaflet, every speech chipped away at the fragile legitimacy of East Germany, or sought to strengthen it. The growing divide, the West's reaction to the uprising made Berliners in both sectors realize something fundamental. The city was more than just a home. It was a stage on which the world's two superpowers performed, each trying to prove their system was the future. For West Berliners, it meant being showcased as freedom's outpost. For East Berliners, it meant living under a regime increasingly desperate to stop its people from listening, leaving, or even dreaming of the West. And as the propaganda war heated up, the flow of refugees continued, turning Berlin into the most contested city of the Cold War. Khrushchev's Berlin ultimatum by the late 1950s, Berlin had become the most dangerous fault line of the Cold War. Millions had already fled East Germany through its open border, and every departure weakened the socialist state. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev decided the time had come to force the West out of Berlin, or risk losing control of Eastern Europe altogether. The problem of Berlin to Moscow, Berlin was a constant humiliation. West Berlin stood as a flourishing capitalist enclave deep inside communist territory. The refugee crisis continued unchecked, draining East Germany of skilled workers. Propaganda broadcasts and Western culture spilled across the border, undermining the socialist message. Khrushchev saw Berlin not just as a city, but as a crack in the Iron Curtain. Unless it was sealed, the entire Soviet bloc could weaken. Khrushchev's bold move on November 10, 1958, Khrushchev issued his famous Berlin ultimatum. The Western allies must withdraw their troops from Berlin within 6 months. The city should become a free, demilitarized city, stripped of Allied influence. If the West refused, the Soviets threatened to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, handing control of Berlin's access routes to the GDR. It was nothing less than a direct challenge. The Western response, the ultimatum, jolted Washington, London, and Paris. To give up West Berlin would mean betraying 2 million citizens and abandoning a critical symbol of freedom. The West refused to bow. U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower stood firm. Our rights in Berlin are not negotiable. Behind closed doors, however, Western leaders feared Khrushchev's threat might spark a showdown. Could Berlin become the flashpoint for nuclear war? Tension mounts as the 6-month deadline approached in 1959. The world held its breath. Diplomats scrambled for a compromise, but neither side would yield. Khrushchev wanted Western troops gone. The Allies insisted they would stay. The crisis brought Europe to the brink. But rather than risk open conflict, Khrushchev extended his deadline again and again. His words had rattled the West, but not broken it. A stage for showmanship, Khrushchev, the blunt, shoe-banging Soviet leader, relished the drama. He used Berlin as a stage to project Soviet strength, hoping to intimidate the West while reassuring his allies. But the more he threatened, the more determined the West became to hold Berlin. And so the ultimatum did not solve the problem. It only froze it, setting the stage for an even bigger confrontation ahead. East Germany's desperation, meanwhile. East German leader Walter Ulbricht grew increasingly anxious. His state was bleeding citizens, his economy was shaky, and his people could see the lights of West Berlin shining brighter every night. He pressed Khrushchev relentlessly. Seal the border. Stop the flight. Save the GDR. Khrushchev knew he could not wait forever. Berlin would have to be closed one way or another. The refugee crisis deepens. 1960 to 61. By 1960, East Germany was bleeding people at an alarming rate. Every day, trains, buses, and trams carried citizens quietly out of East Berlin into the West. From there, many slipped into West Germany, leaving behind jobs, homes, and even families. For the East German regime, it was nothing less than an existential crisis. The numbers tell the story. In 1959 alone, over 140,000 East Germans fled to the West. By 1960, the pace had only increased. By mid-1961, nearly 1,000 people were leaving every single day. It wasn't just farmers or laborers. Doctors, engineers, teachers, and students made up a huge portion of the escapees. This brain drain crippled East Germany's ability to rebuild its economy. Factories lacked specialists. Hospitals lost surgeons. Universities saw their best minds vanish. Every train leaving Berlin carried away not just passengers, but the future of the GDR. While they left for many, life in the East felt increasingly suffocating. Economic hardship, shortages of food, housing, and consumer goods. Political repression. The Stasi monitored citizens. Dissent meant prison. Lack of freedom. Travel restrictions, censorship, and forced loyalty to the party. Meanwhile, West Berlin stood as a glowing counterexample. Shops brimmed with goods, jazz clubs thrived, films played in modern cinemas. It was proof that life could be freer, richer, and more human. Stories of escape. Some East Germans crossed openly, carrying only a suitcase. Others slipped through in the night, avoiding police patrols. A few staged daring escapes, climbing over fences, disguising themselves, or bribing guards. Families were torn apart. A husband might flee first, promising to bring his wife and children later. Sometimes they reunited. Sometimes they never did. Every successful escape inspired others. Every failed attempt fueled fear. Ulbricht's growing panic. East German leader Walter Ulbricht knew his country could not survive this hemorrhage. In speeches, he condemned the traitors fleeing socialism. In private, he begged Moscow for help. If we do not close Berlin, the GDR will collapse, he warned. Khrushchev hesitated. He knew sealing the border would provoke the West. But by 1961, even he admitted the flow of refugees was unsustainable. The Cold War on the edge. By the spring of 1961, the crisis reached a breaking point. The refugee flood was not just a German problem. It was now a global one. Each family that fled made the Soviet system look weaker. Each train full of escapees was a propaganda victory for the West. The East German regime could no longer endure the humiliation. Something drastic had to be done. And soon, Berlin would wake to a shocking new reality. The Berlin Wall. Construction begins August 1961, it was the night of August 12th, 1961. Berliners went to sleep in a city still divided by politics, but open in geography. Families could cross freely from east to west, workers could commute daily, and lovers could meet across the line. But by dawn, the world had changed. Operation Rose. In the early hours of August 13th, 1961, East German police, soldiers, and construction crews moved swiftly through the city under cover of darkness. The operation had a simple code name, Rose. Armed with barbed wire, wooden posts, and hammers, they began sealing the border between East and West Berlin. Streets were dug up. Tram lines were severed. Soldiers with machine guns blocked crossings. When Berliners awoke that morning, they found their city sliced apart. Shock and horror. Imagine walking to your grandmother's house, only to find a barbed wire fence blocking the way. Imagine kissing your girlfriend goodbye at night and waking to discover she was now trapped on the other side. For thousands of families, that nightmare became real. Within hours, East and West Berlin were cut off. Crowds gathered at the barricades, stunned and furious. Some shouted at the soldiers. Others tried to force their way through, only to be turned back at gunpoint. The city was still one in memory, but not in reality. From wire to wall at first, the barrier was crude. Rolls of barbed wire stretched across streets, guarded by police. But within days, workers replaced it with concrete blocks. Soon, a permanent structure began to rise. The Berlin Wall was not just a line of concrete. It was a scar cutting through neighborhoods, parks, and even cemeteries. Apartment buildings became part of the wall, their windows bricked up to prevent escapes. The once bustling city center became a ghostly no-man's land. West Berlin's reaction: the people of West Berlin were horrified. Crowds gathered on their side of the fence, watching loved ones stranded only meters away. Some tried to pass food or letters through the wire. Soldiers pushed them back. Mayor Willy Brandt denounced the wall as a betrayal of human rights. American, British, and French leaders condemned it, but made no move to tear it down. The West knew the wall was a tragedy, but they also knew stopping it could mean war. The East German justification, Walter Ulbricht, and the East German government called it the anti-fascist protection barrier. They claimed the wall was built to protect East Germany from Western spies and saboteurs. But everyone knew the truth. The wall was to keep people in, not out. Lives divided overnight, trains no longer crossed the city. Families were cut in half. Workers lost their jobs. Friends vanished behind concrete and wire. One East Berliner, watching helplessly as soldiers sealed the last open crossings, whispered, "Our prison has just been built." The world reacts across the globe. Headlines screamed, "Berlin cut in two." U.S. President John F. Kennedy, though outraged, privately admitted, "It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." The West accepted the wall, reluctantly. For Berliners, however, it was the beginning of a new nightmare. Families torn apart. The human cost of the wall, the Berlin Wall, wasn't just a barrier of concrete and barbed wire. It was a knife driven into the heart of families, friendships, and communities. Its construction in August 1961 ripped lives apart overnight, leaving scars that would last for generations. A city of broken bonds in the hours before the wall went up, East and West Berliners still visited each other freely. A grandmother might watch her grandchildren in West Berlin. A husband might commute from east to west for work. A young couple might stroll across Alexanderplatz without thinking about politics. But after August 13th, 1961, all of that ended. Grandparents woke to find their families cut off. Workers lost jobs across the border overnight. Lovers found themselves separated by a wall of concrete and soldiers. Many stood for hours at the barricades, calling across the wire, shouting messages, crying, reaching out to touch, but never crossing. The desperate first days and the first weeks after the wall went up, desperate Berliners tried everything to reunite with loved ones. Some jumped from apartment windows into West Berlin, even as East German authorities bricked them shut. Others tunneled under houses, using cellars and sewer lines as escape routes. Families waved to each other across checkpoints, holding up signs that read, "We are alive. We love you." For every daring escape, countless others failed. Soldiers guarded the border day and night. Attempts at flight risked prison, or worse. Stories of heartbreak. The wall was made of concrete, but its cruelty was human. A young woman who worked in West Berlin went to sleep in East Berlin one night, planning to cross in the morning. By sunrise, the border was sealed. She never saw her job or her colleagues again. An elderly couple, one in the west, the other in the east, spent the last years of their lives separated, waving to each other from opposite sides of the fence until one day, only one figure remained. Children found themselves without parents. Mothers trapped in the east sent letters through friends, hoping they reached the west. Each story was a quiet tragedy. Checkpoints and cold goodbyes. The only legal crossings were a handful of checkpoints. Names like Checkpoint Charlie would soon become infamous. Here, Berliners stood in long lines, paperwork in hand, hoping for permission to visit a relative. But permission was rare and visits short. Families would meet in sterile rooms, under watchful eyes, knowing every hug might be the last. Departures were scenes of tears, long embraces, and whispered promises. Someday, we'll be together again. Psychological wounds beyond the physical separations. The wall inflicted deep emotional pain. Trust eroded. Neighbors suspected neighbors. Children grew up not knowing their cousins just a few blocks away. In East Berlin, the Stasi exploited this fear, monitoring phone calls, letters, and visits. Love itself became dangerous, especially if it crossed the border. A symbol of injustice for West Berliners, the wall was an outrage, a scar across their city. For East Berliners, it was a prison fence built by their own government. For the world, it became the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, a wall that did not protect but imprisoned. Concrete divided Berlin, but the true damage was invisible. The empty chairs at dinner tables, the unopened letters, the unanswered phone calls. Escape attempts, tunnels, balloons, and daring plans. The Berlin Wall was built to keep people in, but from the moment it rose, Berliners began plotting ways to break free. Across the 1960s and beyond, desperate East Germans turned ingenuity into weapons, creating some of the most daring and dangerous escape attempts in history. The first jumps in the wall's early days, when it was still mostly barbed wire, brave souls simply leapt across. A young border guard, Konrad Schumann, famously sprinted over the wire into West Berlin in August 1961, his leap captured in an iconic photograph. Dozens of others vaulted fences, ran through half-finished barricades, or smashed vehicles through weak spots. But as the wall grew taller, wider, and deadlier, escape became more difficult and more creative. Tunnels beneath the wall, the sandy soil beneath Berlin, became the battleground of escape. Students, engineers, and ordinary citizens dug tunnels, sometimes stretching hundreds of feet. Tunnel 29, dug by a group of young West Berliners, rescued 29 people in 1962. The story later inspired books, documentaries, and films. Other tunnels collapsed, were discovered, or betrayed. Many diggers risked their lives crawling in the dark, armed with little more than shovels and buckets. For every successful tunnel, dozens ended in tragedy, with diggers arrested, imprisoned, or shot. Balloons, boats, and flying cars. When the ground was sealed, some turned to the skies. In 1979, two East German families stitched together homemade hot air balloons from sheets and scraps of fabric. One night, they soared over the wall and landed safely in the West. Others built gliders, hid inside car engines, or even tried to float across rivers in improvised boats. Each escape attempt carried the same deadly risk: discovery by the border guards. Checkpoint Charlie and smuggling at the official checkpoints. Smugglers grew creative. Hidden compartments in cars carried children beneath floorboards. Suitcases were rigged to conceal tiny spaces. Forged documents tricked guards, at least for a while. But every trick risked exposure, and the East German border police became increasingly skilled at detection. the price of failure for every successful escape. Others ended in death. Guards had orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross illegally. The death strip, a wide, barren zone between inner and outer walls, was designed to make escape impossible. Some were killed as they ran. Others were dragged away to prison, their families punished. The wall became not just a barrier, but a killing ground. While they tried to spite the dangers, thousands risked everything. They weren't chasing wealth, they were chasing freedom. To see family, to speak without fear, to live without being watched by the Stasi. Every escape attempt, successful or not, was a silent rebellion against the wall itself. A symbol of resistance for West Berliners. Escape stories were tales of courage. For East Germans, they were whispers of hope. And for the world, they became proof that no wall, no matter how tall, could crush the human desire for freedom. But the wall remained, growing stronger, more fortified, more impossible. And soon, it would bring the world's two greatest powers to the edge of nuclear war. The Checkpoint Charlie Standoff, October 1961 and October 1961. The Cold War's tension in Berlin reached a dangerous new peak. What began as a routine confrontation at Checkpoint Charlie, one of the few legal crossings between East and West Berlin, escalated into a terrifying standoff that could have sparked World War III. The trigger of the crisis started simply. East German border guards refused to allow U.S. diplomats to cross into East Berlin without proper documentation. The Americans refused to comply, insisting that their diplomats had the right to move freely throughout the entire city under four-power agreements. Soon, tanks from both sides were deployed to the checkpoint. American M48 Pattons faced Soviet T-54s in a tense, silent duel across a narrow street. The city holds its breath for Berliners. The standoff was terrifying. Families watched from windows as armored vehicles rolled into place. Rumors spread. A single shot could ignite a nuclear exchange. West Berliners felt trapped between loyalty to the West and the immediate threat of devastation. East Berliners, under strict surveillance, feared being caught in the crossfire. Nuclear tension, both superpowers were acutely aware of the stakes. The United States had nuclear weapons at the ready in West Germany. The Soviet Union had missiles within striking distance of Western Europe. A misstep by either side could trigger annihilation. The world watched, holding its collective breath, as tanks faced each other, engines idling, guns pointed, and soldiers tense. Diplomacy saves the day. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. Behind the scenes, high-level diplomats from Washington and Moscow negotiated a withdrawal. Kennedy administration officials stressed restraint and the importance of avoiding war. Khrushchev agreed to pull back Soviet tanks, but maintained East German control over the border. Within 16 hours, the standoff ended peacefully. Tanks withdrew. Checkpoint Charlie remained, but Berlin had narrowly avoided disaster. The standoff sent a clear message to both sides. Berlin was a flashpoint that could ignite a global conflict. It also demonstrated that diplomacy, careful planning, and restraint could avert catastrophe. For Berliners, it was a chilling lesson. Every day behind the wall carried the potential for violence, but courage and patience could sometimes prevent tragedy. Legacy of the standoff Checkpoint Charlie became a symbol of Cold War tension at its most dangerous, of the thin line between peace and nuclear war, and of a city that lived daily under the shadow of superpowers, yet refused to surrender its spirit. Berliners understood that the wall and the checkpoints were more than concrete and barbed wire. They were the front lines of a global struggle for survival, freedom, and power. Life under the wall. Everyday struggles for the millions of Berliners trapped on either side of the wall. Daily life became a delicate balance of survival, routine, and adaptation. Beyond the dramatic standoffs and daring escapes, the wall shaped the rhythms of life in ways both subtle and profound. The division of neighborhoods, entire neighborhoods were split in half. Streets that once hummed with activity became dead ends. Schools, shops, and churches suddenly fell on opposite sides. Some children could no longer attend the schools they had started in the morning. Families had to adapt to new routines, often planning their days around checkpoints or limited access routes. Even pets became victims of division. Dogs and cats were trapped in one sector, separated from their owners. The mundane became a symbol of the wall's reach. Food, work, and scarcity life in West Berlin was materially easier. Shops were stocked with goods, cinemas played the latest films, and cafes thrived. But West Berliners were still an isolated island, surrounded by East Germany. Commuting, supply chains, and utilities required constant coordination with a hostile neighbor. In East Berlin, shortages persisted. While propaganda promised abundance, reality was different. Long lines at bakeries and butcher shops, limited clothing and household items, restricted access to Western newspapers, radio, and culture. Workers labored under strict quotas, often monitored by Stasi informants. Even minor dissent could lead to interrogation, imprisonment, or public shaming. Social life, under surveillance life in East Berlin was permeated by the presence of the Stasi, the secret police. Neighbors reported neighbors, coworkers watched coworkers, and families feared casual conversations could be reported. This climate of suspicion affected everything. Friendships became cautious, love was discreet, and trust was scarce. Children grew up learning to navigate a world where every word might be overheard. West Berlin, a city of contrasts, West Berliners lived in a mix of freedom and anxiety. Though materially better off, they were aware of their vulnerability. Surrounded by East Germany, any conflict could cut them off entirely. Airlifts and supply routes reminded them of past crises like the 1948 blockade. Cultural life thrived. However, music, art, and cinema flourished as forms of resistance, expression, and hope. West Berlin became a beacon of Western values in the heart of the Eastern Bloc. Psychological impact, both sides experienced the wall's invisible weight. East Berliners felt trapped, constrained, and constantly watched. West Berliners felt isolated, living in a fortress of democracy. The wall shaped dreams, careers, relationships, and choices. It was not just concrete, it was a psychological barrier, teaching fear, resilience, and ingenuity. Everyday acts of resistance, even in the mundane, resistance persisted. East Berliners found ways to listen to Western radio, share contraband newspapers, and subtly defy the Stasi. West Berliners supported refugees, celebrated cultural freedoms, and reminded the world that Berlin remained the front line of human aspiration against oppression. Life under the wall was harsh. It revealed the courage of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. The 1970s, détente and life behind the wall. By the 1970s, the Berlin Wall had become a fixture, its initial shock replaced by grim routine. Yet the decade brought new dynamics. While the wall remained, international politics shifted, and Berlin experienced a complex mix of tension, negotiation, and cautious optimism. The era of détente, the 1970s, saw a thaw in Cold War hostilities. Détente, the easing of tensions between East and West, emerged as a key policy. Leaders on both sides sought stability. West Germany, under Chancellor Willy Brandt, pursued Ostpolitik, a policy aimed at normalizing relations with East Germany. The US and the USSR signed treaties limiting nuclear arms and promoting dialogue. Berlin remained central to these negotiations. While the wall still divided families, the city became a platform for diplomacy, reducing the risk of sudden crises like the 1961 standoff. Daily life behind the wall. Despite political shifts, life remained starkly different on either side. East Berlin, the Stasi maintained surveillance, rationing persisted, and citizens faced limitations on travel and expression. Yet there were small comforts, improved housing projects, public health programs, and cultural events approved by the state. Citizens learned to adapt, creating private spaces of relative freedom inside their homes. West Berlin, life was relatively prosperous, with access to consumer goods, Western media, and cultural institutions. However, West Berlin remained isolated geographically, dependent on supply corridors and the goodwill of the surrounding GDR. Cultural resilience: both sides developed distinctive cultures shaped by their circumstances. East Berliners found subtle ways to resist. Music, literature, and art often carried hidden messages criticizing the regime. Private gatherings and secret clubs became spaces for self-expression. West Berliners celebrated freedom openly. Jazz clubs, theaters, and underground movements thrived. Students and artists made West Berlin a hub of innovation, attracting attention from across Europe. The wall as a symbol even during détente. The wall was more than a barrier. It remained a symbol of division, oppression, and the human cost of ideology. Photographs of barbed wire, guard towers, and watchtowers circulated globally, reminding the world that Berlin was still the epicenter of Cold War tension. Families and adaptation: by the 1970s, generations had grown up knowing the wall as a fact of life. Families developed coping mechanisms. Letters were exchanged with care. Visits were planned months in advance. Children grew up understanding that crossing the border was forbidden, yet dreamed of the day freedom might return. While hope persisted, the wall had created a psychological divide as powerful as the physical one. The global spotlight: détente brought attention to Berlin as a test case for East-West relations. Every summit, treaty, and public statement reflected back on the city. Berliners, consciously or not, lived in a place where local life had international significance. Even in routine, the shadow of politics remained. West Berlin was an outpost of democracy. East Berlin, a showcase of socialism. And for both, the wall was the defining structure of their era. The 1980s, growing pressure and the seeds of change. By the 1980s, the Berlin Wall had stood for nearly 2 decades. Its concrete towers, guard posts, and barbed wire had become symbols of a divided world. Yet beneath the surface, pressures were mounting that would ultimately shake the foundations of the GDR and the Eastern Bloc. Economic strains: East Germany's economy was faltering. The state-controlled system struggled to provide basic goods and services. Industrial production lagged behind the West, and consumer shortages were chronic. Meanwhile, West Berliners enjoyed prosperity, access to Western technology, and cultural freedoms. The contrast between the two sides of the city became increasingly stark, highlighting the limitations of socialism in East Germany. Political discontent: the Stasi maintained an atmosphere of constant surveillance, but discontent grew quietly in East Berlin. Workers and students whispered about corruption, inefficiency, and the absurdities of daily life under the regime. Small protests, cultural expressions, and underground publications began to form a network of dissent. Although the state suppressed these efforts ruthlessly, the seeds of change were being planted. Influence of the Western media continued to seep through the wall. Radio broadcasts, magazines, and television provided glimpses of life beyond the border. The contrast was impossible to ignore. West Berlin remained a beacon of hope. Families could hear news from the outside world. Young people compared the opportunities they saw on TV to the restrictions of their own city. Dissatisfaction simmered, quietly fueling the desire for reform. Gorbachev's reforms in the Eastern Bloc: by the mid-1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. While aimed at revitalizing the USSR, these reforms had a ripple effect across Eastern Europe, including East Germany. East Berliners, already aware of the West, began demanding similar reforms. More freedom, economic opportunities, and the ability to travel. The human cost of isolation: the wall had become a daily reality, but its psychological toll remained profound. Generations had grown up knowing the wall as permanent. Families remained separated despite decades of petitions and requests. Escape attempts persisted, though more dangerous than ever. Yet the combination of economic stagnation, political repression, and exposure to Western life ensured that the wall's hold on hearts and minds was weakening. A city poised for change: by the late 1980s, Berlin was ready for transformation. The wall still stood, soldiers still patrolled the death strip, and checkpoints still controlled access. But the forces that had built it, fear, ideology, and brute power, were eroding. The world would soon witness that even the strongest walls cannot contain human aspiration forever. 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall. November 1989 began like any other month in Berlin, but by the end of it, the world would witness a moment that would echo through history. The Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of Cold War division, was about to fall. The winds of change. By 1989, East Germany was in crisis. Economic stagnation, political dissatisfaction, and the influence of reform movements in neighboring Eastern Bloc countries had created an unstoppable momentum. Mass protests erupted across East German cities. Citizens demanded freedom of travel, democratic reforms, and an end to repression. Thousands marched peacefully in Leipzig, Dresden, and East Berlin, chanting slogans and waving banners. The regime, led by Erich Honecker, tried to maintain control, but increasingly appeared powerless. The GDR leadership was trapped between the people's demands and the fear of losing Soviet support, which was itself waning under Gorbachev's policies. A miscommunication sparks history. On November 9, 1989, a press conference changed everything. Government spokesman Gunter Schabowski, asked about new travel regulations, mistakenly announced that East Berliners could cross into West Berlin immediately without delay. Thousands gathered at the checkpoints, demanding passage. Border guards, unprepared and unsure of orders, faced an impossible situation. Some opened the gates, overwhelmed by the crowds. Others were unsure whether to use force, hesitating in fear of igniting violence. By the evening, the wall was breached. Berliners climbed over, chipped away at concrete, and celebrated with tears, cheers, and embraces. The human celebration, the scenes were unforgettable. Families long separated finally reunited on the streets. Strangers hugged, danced, and sang atop the wall. Western and Eastern Berliners explored each other's neighborhoods for the first time in decades. Photographers captured moments that would become iconic. Young people perched on the wall with sledgehammers, elderly couples embracing, soldiers smiling with citizens. The world watches across the globe. The fall of the wall was broadcast live. Leaders hailed it as the triumph of freedom over oppression and the end of the Cold War's most tangible symbol. President George H.W. Bush called it a moment of unprecedented joy, while Mikhail Gorbachev, watching from Moscow, noted that history was indeed turning. The legacy of the fall of the wall had stood for 28 years, dividing a city, a nation, and the world. Its fall was more than the removal of concrete and barbed wire. It was the reunification of families, cultures, and ideals. Berliners' new life would not instantly return to normal. Decades of separation had left deep scars. Yet hope surged. The impossible had happened. A city divided by fear and ideology had been reunited by courage and the unstoppable desire for freedom. A symbol eternal from 1961 to 1989, the wall had been a prison for millions, a death trap for those attempting escape, a global symbol of Cold War tension. Its fall, however, became a symbol of resilience, hope, and the power of human will. Berlin would never be the same again, but in the rubble of the wall, the city found a renewed spirit, a city determined to remember the past while embracing the future. Reunification and reconstruction. Berlin after the wall. With the Berlin Wall gone, the city faced a monumental task, healing decades of division while forging a new, unified identity. Reunification was not merely a political event. It was a human, cultural, and economic challenge of unprecedented scale. The path to reunification following the fall of the wall in November 1989, momentum for reunification accelerated. East Germany's government collapsed, and negotiations began with West Germany, the Allies, and the Soviet Union. By October 3, 1990, less than a year after the wall fell, Germany was officially reunified. Berlin became the capital of a single, united nation, reclaiming its historical role at the heart of Europe. Rebuilding the city. Reunification brought an enormous reconstruction effort. Berlin had been physically and psychologically divided for decades. East Berlin bore the weight of neglected infrastructure, Soviet-style apartment blocks, and decades of economic stagnation. West Berlin, while more prosperous, had gaps in development and urban planning caused by isolation. Architects, engineers, and planners faced the challenge of reconnecting streets, modernizing utilities, and restoring historical landmarks. Iconic sites like the Brandenburg Gate were reopened and rebuilt, becoming symbols of a new Berlin. Economic and social integration, reunification, required blending two very different economies. East Berliners faced the challenge of adapting to a capitalist system after decades under state socialism. Many lost jobs as uncompetitive industries closed. New opportunities arose in technology, services, and media. West Berlin investments helped modernize the city, but disparities persisted, creating social tensions that lasted for years. Culturally, the city thrived. Former East Berlin districts preserved their unique character, blending with Western influence to create a dynamic, diverse urban landscape. Healing psychological divides, the wall had left deep emotional scars. Families had been separated for decades, and a generation had grown up knowing only division. Reunification offered a chance to reconnect. Schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces integrated East and West Berliners. Memorials and museums were established to honor those who had suffered or died trying to escape. Stories of resilience, courage, and survival were shared widely, helping the city process its painful past. Berlin's global symbolism, the reunified Berlin, became more than a German capital. It was a global symbol of freedom and resilience. Tourists, journalists, and historians flocked to the city to witness the transformation. The wall's remnants were preserved in certain locations, serving as reminders of oppression, courage, and the power of unity. Berlin's story inspired movements around the world, proving that even the most entrenched divisions could eventually be overcome. A new chapter begins by the mid-1990s. Berlin was thriving as a unified city. Its economy was modernizing rapidly. Cultural life flourished with theaters, museums, and music festivals. The population began to heal, though memories of separation endured. The city had survived war, occupation, division, and oppression. Now, reunited, Berlin looked to the future while honoring its complex past. Legacy of Berlin. Lessons from a divided city. Berlin's story is one of resilience, tragedy, and triumph. From the ruins of World War II to the heights of Cold War tension, from the cruel division of the wall to the joy of reunification, Berlin's history offers lessons that resonate far beyond its borders. A city shaped by conflict, Berlin has always been a stage for history. In the 20th century alone, it endured the devastation of World War II, lived under the occupation of 4 global powers, became the epicenter of Cold War confrontation. These experiences shaped not just the city's infrastructure, but its culture, identity, and psyche. Every street, square, and building tells a story of struggle and survival. The human cost of division. The Berlin Wall was more than concrete. It was a human tragedy. Families were separated, lives were lost, dreams were deferred. Yet the endurance of ordinary Berliners, workers, students, parents, and children, proved that even the harshest barriers could not crush the human spirit. The stories of escape, resistance, and perseverance remain powerful reminders of courage in the face of oppression. A symbol of freedom and hope, the fall of the wall in 1989 became a global symbol. It demonstrated the power of collective will against authoritarian control. It inspired movements for democracy and human rights worldwide. It proved that walls, physical or ideological, cannot contain freedom indefinitely. Berlin's liberation became a beacon, reminding the world that change is possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Lessons for the world. The legacy of Berlin offers timeless lessons. Resilience matters. Even under oppression, individuals can resist, endure, and adapt. Dialogue prevents disaster. Diplomacy, as during the checkpoint Charlie standoff, can avert catastrophe. Human connection transcends barriers. Families, communities, and friendships endure even when walls are built. Freedom is invaluable. The longing for liberty cannot be contained indefinitely. Modern Berlin today, Berlin is a vibrant, united city. Its streets echo with history, but its citizens look forward. Former East and West districts now form a dynamic cultural and economic landscape. Memorials, museums, and preserved sections of the wall educate future generations. Berlin thrives as a global city, a symbol of reconciliation and hope. Enduring inspiration, Berlin's journey from devastation to division to reunification demonstrates the power of human will, the resilience of communities, and the possibility of redemption. It is a city that reminds us, even in the darkest hours, hope can prevail, walls can fall, and the human spirit can reclaim its freedom. The lessons of Berlin continue to resonate in history, in politics, and in the hearts of all who value liberty. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of Berlin, from the ruins of war, through the tension of Allied occupation, the division of the wall, and finally, to reunification and hope. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth military history stories. Drop a comment below and let us know which moment in Berlin's history fascinated you the most, or if there's another event you'd like us to explore. Stay tuned, because history is full of untold stories, and every city, every battle, every person has a tale waiting to be discovered. Thanks for listening to History Radio. See you in the next story.